Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Tyler Bailey, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire, just 3 months ago. I never should have gone alone, and that's what everyone tells you, right? Never hike alone, especially not on unfamiliar trails. But after Melissa left, taking half our friends in the divorce, I needed space. Time away from sympathetic glances and awkward conversations. The wilderness called to me with its promise of isolation and clarity. I just didn't understand what form that isolation would take. It was early October when I parked my Subaru at the Lincoln Woods trailhead. The White Mountains were ablaze with autumn color, the maples and birches creating a tapestry of red and gold against the evergreen backdrop. I planned a 5-day solo trek along the Pemigewasset Wilderness Loop, one of the more challenging routes in the White Mountains, but supposedly worth every grueling mile for the views alone. My backpack weighed heavy as I signed the trail register, noting my planned route and expected return date. The ranger on duty, a weathered man in his 60s named Frank, looked me over with a critical eye. "Solo, huh?" he asked, his voice like gravel underfoot. "Need some time to clear my head," I replied, adjusting my shoulder straps. Frank nodded slowly. "Stay on the marked trails. We've had some issues lately." Issues? Hikers reporting strange things. Probably just fall tourists seeing shadows. He shrugged, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. And steer clear of Owl's Head Mountain after dark. Local superstition, but he didn't finish the thought, and I didn't press. New England was full of local legends and haunted hills. I thanked him and headed out onto the trail, eager to leave civilization behind. The first day was perfect. The weather held clear and cool, the trail challenging but manageable. I made good time, passing the Franconia Falls and heading deeper into the wilderness. By late afternoon, I'd reached the junction where the Lincoln Brook Trail split off toward Owl's Head Mountain, the place Frank had warned about. I checked my map and decided to camp at the designated site near Black Pond, still a good distance from Owl's Head. As I set up my tent, the forest grew quiet in that peculiar way it sometimes does, as if holding its breath. No birds called. No squirrels rustled through the underbrush. Just the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I attributed it to the approaching evening and focused on building a small fire. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic thumping from somewhere deep in the forest. Not quite footsteps, more like a heartbeat. I stood frozen, listening as it grew slightly louder, then faded again. Just a grouse, I told myself. They drum their wings this time of year. But grouse usually stopped at dusk, and night was falling fast. I cooked a simple meal of dehydrated stew over my camp stove, trying to ignore the intermittent thumping that seemed to circle my campsite at a distance. The fire cast dancing shadows among the trees, and more than once I caught movement at the edge of my vision, only to find nothing there when I turned. Sleep came uneasily that night. I dreamed of being watched by countless eyes from the darkness beyond my tent. In my dream, the thumping grew louder until it matched the panicked beating of my own heart. I woke in a cold sweat around 3 a.m., certain I'd heard something moving just outside my tent. I fumbled for my headlamp and switched it on, the beam cutting through the nylon walls of my tent like they weren't there at all. Outside, a thick mist had rolled in, diffusing the light and making everything look ghostly and uncertain. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting breaking the silence. No response came, but the mist seemed to retreat slightly from my tent, as if startled by my voice. I unzipped the tent flap and peered out. My campfire had died to embers hours ago, but something about the way they glowed seemed wrong. Instead of the usual orange-red, they pulsed with an unnatural bluish light. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, the embers appeared normal, just my imagination working overtime in an unfamiliar forest. I zipped the tent closed and tried to fall back asleep, but rest evaded me until dawn painted the sky with pale fingers of light. The second day dawned misty but promised to clear. I packed up quickly, eager to leave behind the strange unease of the night. My plan was to hike up to Bond Cliff, one of the most spectacular ridgelines in the Whites, and camp at Guyotte Shelter. It would be a strenuous day with significant elevation gain, but the forecast looked good. As I hiked, the forest gradually came alive around me. Birds called from the canopy, and occasionally I spotted deer watching me warily from between the trees. My spirits lifted with the mist, and by midday I had convinced myself that the previous night's eeriness was nothing more than fatigue and an overactive imagination. The views from Bond Cliff were as spectacular as promised, rugged mountains rolling away in all directions, their slopes painted with autumn colors. For a moment, standing on that exposed ridge with the wind in my face, I felt truly free. The weight of my failed marriage and the life I'd need to rebuild seemed distant and manageable. I took photos, ate lunch, and started the descent toward Guyotte Shelter, hoping to arrive before dark. That's when my GPS device began to malfunction. The screen would flicker, coordinates jumping wildly before settling again. Then it died completely despite having fresh batteries. No problem, I thought. I had a paper map and compass. I was an experienced hiker. This was just an inconvenience. But when I pulled out my compass, the needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on north. I tapped it, recalibrated, but nothing worked. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I realized I would need to rely on trailblazes and my own sense of direction. The afternoon grew strangely dark as clouds rolled in from nowhere, obscuring the peaks I'd used as landmarks. The temperature dropped suddenly, and my breath fogged in front of me. Fall in the White Mountains was unpredictable, but this rapid change felt deliberate somehow. I quickened my pace, following the trail markers down from Bond Cliff toward the shelter. The path grew increasingly difficult to follow as shadows lengthened across the forest floor. Twice I had to backtrack after losing the trail entirely. By the time I reached what should have been the junction with the Bond Cliff Trail, I was no longer certain of my location. The trail marker was there, but it had been altered. The white blaze was smeared with something dark that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. When I touched it, my fingers came away clean. It was just discoloration from weather and time, I told myself. Nothing sinister. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, not enough to reach Guyotte Shelter safely with the trail conditions deteriorating. I needed to make camp soon. According to my map, there was a small stream nearby that would provide water. I followed what I hoped was the correct path downhill. The stream was where it should be, but something about it struck me as wrong immediately. The water ran clear but seemed oddly still in places, as if time itself slowed in the deeper pools. When I dipped my filter bottle into one such pool, the water felt warm against my hand, almost body temperature. I pulled back quickly, a visceral revulsion washing over me. I filled my bottles from a faster-moving section upstream and retreated to a small clearing about 50 yards from the water to make camp. As I set up my tent, I noticed scratches on several tree trunks surrounding the clearing, deep gouges in the bark that formed no pattern I could recognize but somehow seemed intentional. Night fell swiftly, the darkness absolute under the cloud cover. No stars, no moon. Just me and my small fire pushing back against the encroaching blackness. I heated water for my freeze-dried meal but found I had little appetite. The forest had gone silent again, the same breathless quiet from the previous night. The thumping returned as I sat by my fire, trying to warm the perpetual chill that had settled into my bones. This time, it sounded closer, more insistent. A rhythm that almost suggested words if I listened too carefully. I put on my headphones and played music from my phone, drowning out the forest sounds until my battery warned it was running low. I was about to retreat to my tent when a sharp crack like a branch breaking underfoot sounded just beyond the ring of firelight. I swung my headlamp toward the noise and caught a glimpse of something pale disappearing behind a tree, something that moved on two legs but with a jerking, unnatural gait. "Hello," I called, reaching for my hiking poles, the closest things I had to weapons. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but the thumping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I doused my fire quickly and ducked into my tent, zipping it closed as if the thin nylon could protect me from whatever lurked in the darkness. Inside, I arranged my gear to block the entrance and kept my knife and headlamp close at hand. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion eventually dragged me under. The dream, when it came, was vivid and horrifying. I stood in a clearing much like the one where I'd camped, but the trees around it were twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. At the center of the clearing stood a figure with its back to me, thin, pale, naked, except for a coating of dark mud or ash that streaked its emaciated form. As I watched, unable to move or speak, the figure began to turn. Slowly, agonizingly, it rotated toward me. I desperately wanted to wake up before I saw its face, but my unconscious mind held me captive. Just as it turned fully, revealing a face that was not a face at all but a writhing mass of shadows, I woke with a start. Something was touching my tent. Not the wind or a branch, but deliberate pressure tracing the outline of my huddled form inside. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as whatever it was moved around the perimeter of my shelter. The nylon dimpled inward in small points of pressure like fingertips or claws, testing for a way in. Then came the voice, if you could call it that. A whispering that seemed to emanate not from a single source but from the air itself, words in no language I recognized but that nonetheless conveyed malevolent intent. I clutched my knife with sweat-slicked palms, certain that at any moment the tent fabric would tear and I would come face to face with the owner of that terrible voice. Instead, after what felt like hours, the pressure vanished. The whispering faded. Dawn broke, gray and misty through the trees. I waited until full light before cautiously unzipping my tent. The clearing looked undisturbed at first glance, but when I examined the ground around my shelter, I found odd indentations in the soft earth, not quite footprints, more like something heavy had been dragged in a circle around my tent. More disturbing were the marks on the tent itself. The rain fly, which had been a bright blue, was now discolored in places with ashy handprints too large to be human. They smeared when I touched them, leaving a greasy residue on my fingers that smelled of rot and something metallic like old blood. I needed to get back to civilization. Something was very wrong in these woods, and I wanted no part of it. I packed hastily, abandoning any plan of continuing my trek. The shortest route back to my car would take me past Owl's Head Mountain, the place the ranger had warned about. But in daylight, I decided the fastest way out was worth the risk. The forest felt different as I hiked that morning. The trees seemed to lean inward over the trail, branches reaching lower than they should. Twice I became disoriented despite following clear trail markers, finding myself facing the wrong direction or walking in circles. Each time, I realized I had been gradually turning toward Owl's Head rather than away from it. By noon, I should have reached the junction with the Lincoln Brook Trail, but the landscape had become unfamiliar. The trail widened into what appeared to be an old logging road not marked on my map. Desperate for any sign of human presence, I followed it. The road led to a small clearing where the remains of a cabin stood, just the stone foundation and chimney, the wooden structure long since collapsed or burned. Something about the place raised the hair on my neck. It felt used, inhabited, despite its obvious abandonment. I approached cautiously, hoping to find something that might help me orient myself. The foundation was filled with decades of fallen leaves and forest debris, but someone, or something, had cleared a rough circle in the center. Within that circle lay small animal bones arranged in a pattern around a larger bone that could only have been human, a femur, yellowed with age. I backed away quickly, nearly tripping over a half-buried sign at the edge of the clearing. I brushed away the dirt and leaves to reveal faded lettering. Stillwater. Camp. Private property, no trespassing. Stillwater. The name tickled something in my memory. Hadn't there been some incident here years ago? Something the older locals still talked about in hushed tones. I had no time to dwell on it. The day was advancing, and I needed to find the main trail again. I chose a direction that I hoped would intersect with the Lincoln Brook Trail and pushed through the underbrush. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing closer together as if trying to bar my way. Their bark was marked with the same strange gouges I'd seen at my campsite. Some were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. I broke through the tree line into another clearing and stopped cold. Before me stood a crude structure assembled from branches and animal hides stretched over a frame of lashed-together saplings. It resembled a primitive tent or sweat lodge, but the hides, some were clearly from deer or moose, but others had an unsettlingly human proportion to them. Movement caught my eye, a figure emerging from the forest on the far side of the clearing. Relief flooded through me at the sight of another person, until they stepped fully into view. The man who stood watching me was gaunt to the point of starvation, his skin weathered to leather by exposure. He wore tattered hiking clothes at least a decade out of date, the fabric stained and torn. His beard reached nearly to his waist, matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. But it was his eyes that froze my blood, milky white and sightless, yet somehow fixed unerringly on me. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a dry rasp, like dead leaves skittering across stone. "It's hunting." "Who's hunting?" I managed to ask, my own voice barely a whisper. The man tilted his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Not who, what?" He took a shambling step toward me. It was here before the mountains, before people. It sleeps and wakes and hungers. "I'm lost," I said, fighting the urge to run. Something told me that fleeing would trigger this man, if he was still a man, to chase. "I'm trying to get back to the Lincoln Woods trailhead." "No trail goes there anymore," he said, taking another step closer. I could smell him now, an odor of unwashed body, smoke, and something underneath that reminded me of the warm water in the stream. "Not from here. It changes the paths, brings you to it." "What does? What's out here?" He smiled, revealing blackened gums and sharpened teeth. "The Wendigo. The hunger that walks. The locals have many names for it. The Abenaki people knew to avoid these mountains when the signs appeared." "What signs?" My mouth had gone dry, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The silence. The mist that moves against the wind. The blue fire." He gestured vaguely toward Owl's Head Mountain, visible now through the trees. "It sleeps in the caves up there, but it walks at night, looking for the lost and lonely." He took another step toward me, and I noticed something I had missed before. His left leg ended in a crude prosthesis fashioned from wood and animal hide. Not just any wood. A human femur formed part of the structure, matching the one I'd seen in the ruined cabin. "You're from the Stillwater camp," I realized aloud. "There was an accident. Hikers who disappeared." 10 years ago," he nodded. 6 of us came. Only I remain." His sightless eyes seemed to look through me. "It took my eyes first, so I couldn't find my way out. Then my leg, so I couldn't run. It keeps me alive, brings me others when it can." My blood went cold. "Others? Like you, lost, alone." His head tilted again, listening. "It's coming now. Can you hear it?" And I could, that rhythmic thumping, growing louder by the second. It wasn't like a heartbeat as I'd first thought. It was footsteps. Something massive, moving fast through the forest toward us. "Run, if you want," the blind man said, retreating toward his shelter. "It enjoys the chase, or stay and meet what hungers in these mountains. I ran. Panic gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, my only thought to put distance between myself and whatever approached the clearing. The blind man's laughter followed me, high and broken like shattering glass. I had no direction, no plan beyond escape. The forest blurred around me as branches whipped my face and tore at my clothes. Behind me, the thumping grew louder, faster, matching my pace and then exceeding it. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of something pale and enormous moving with unnatural speed. It ran on two legs but bent forward like an animal, its arms, too long, too thin, reaching out before it. The path ahead forked. Without thinking, I veered left, down a steep slope that turned into an almost vertical drop. I half ran, half fell down the incline, using trees to break my momentum. Sharp rocks cut through my pants, tearing skin from my shins, but fear numbed the pain. At the bottom lay a stream, perhaps the same one I'd encountered earlier. I splashed across, hoping water might somehow break my trail. On the far bank, I spotted a fallen tree that had created a small cave of roots and earth. Without hesitation, I crawled inside, pressing myself as far back into the darkness as possible. Outside, the forest went silent. The thumping stopped. I covered my mouth with both hands to quiet my ragged breathing and waited. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My muscles cramped from holding still, but I dared not move. Just as I began to hope the thing had lost my trail, soil rained down from above as something heavy stepped onto the fallen tree. A sound came then. Not the whispering I'd heard at my tent, but a deep, rattling moan that seemed to emanate from both everywhere and nowhere at once. The roots above me creaked as the creature shifted its weight, sending more dirt showering down. Something probed into the entrance of my hiding place. A hand, but not a hand. The fingers were too numerous, too long, jointed in ways human fingers couldn't bend. The skin was stretched tight over bone, mottled gray-white like a corpse left in water. It groped blindly, inches from my face. I stopped breathing entirely, my lungs burning for air. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as the hand withdrew. The weight above shifted again. I heard a wet, snuffling sound like an animal scenting the air. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence vanished. The forest sounds gradually returned. First insects, then birds cautiously resuming their calls. Still, I remained frozen in my hiding place until the growing darkness warned me that night would soon fall. I couldn't stay in the forest after dark. Not again. With extreme caution, I extracted myself from beneath the fallen tree and surveyed my surroundings. The stream beside me flowed roughly east, if the position of the setting sun was any indication. Water always led to civilization eventually. I followed the stream, moving as quickly and quietly as possible while staying alert for any sign of pursuit. The terrain began to look vaguely familiar as twilight deepened into true darkness. I switched on my headlamp, its beam comfortingly bright in the gathering gloom. After another hour of tense hiking, the stream widened and joined a larger river that I recognized with a surge of hope. The Pemigewasset River, which would lead directly back to the Lincoln Woods trailhead and my car. The relative openness of the riverbank allowed me to move faster, though every shadow made me flinch. Every sound sent adrenaline coursing through my system. The thumping never returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, followed at a distance. It was fully dark when I finally spotted the lights of the ranger station through the trees. I broke into a desperate run, not stopping until I reached the gravel parking lot where my car waited, untouched after 3 days. Frank, the ranger, was locking up the station as I stumbled into the lot. "Jesus Christ!" he exclaimed, hurrying over as I collapsed against my car. "What happened to you?" I must have been a sight, clothes torn, face scratched, caked with dirt and dried blood from my scraped legs. I opened my mouth to tell him everything but stopped at the look in his eyes. Not surprise, I realized. Recognition. "You went near Owl's Head," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, struggling to catch my breath. Frank sighed heavily. "Let's get you inside. Clean you up." In the fluorescent light of the ranger station bathroom, I looked even worse than I'd imagined. Wild-eyed, filthy, with a haunted expression I'd never seen on my own face before. Frank gave me first aid supplies and a bottle of water while I washed the worst of the dirt away. "You're not the first," he said when I emerged. "Something about those woods. They change people, or show them things." "There was a man," I said, my voice hoarse. "Living out there. He said he was from Stillwater Camp." Frank went very still. "That's not possible. The Stillwater incident was nearly 10 years ago. Search and rescue combed those mountains for weeks. No survivors." "He's out there," I insisted, "living in some kind of primitive shelter. Blind. Missing a leg. He said it keeps him alive." "Who keeps him alive?" I couldn't bring myself to repeat the blind man's words. Saying it aloud would make it too real, too present even here in the safety of the station. "I need to report this," Frank said after a long silence. "Whatever you encountered out there, man, animal, or something else, it's a danger to hikers. We'll send a team to investigate." "No," I said quickly, surprising myself with my vehemence. "Don't send anyone up there after dark. It hunts at night." Frank studied me carefully, then nodded. "First light tomorrow. I'll call it in now." He made the call while I sat numbly in a folding chair, sipping water that tasted blissfully clean and normal. When he hung up, he offered to drive me to the hospital in Lincoln, but I declined. All I wanted was to get as far from these mountains as possible. "At least let me follow you to the main road," he insisted. "Make sure you get there safely." I agreed to that and thanked him for his help. As I stood to leave, he placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Whatever you think you saw out there," he said quietly, "some things are better left in the woods. Some stories shouldn't be told, for your own good." I nodded, understanding his warning all too well. The drive home was a blur. Every dark stretch of road, every shadow in my headlights set my heart racing. I drove straight through the night, stopping only for gas, unwilling to close my eyes until I was safely back in my apartment with doors locked and lights blazing. In the days that followed, I searched online for information about the Stillwater Camp incident. I found only brief mentions in local newspapers. 6 hikers disappeared in the White Mountain National Forest in October 2014. The official report cited exposure and misadventure. Bodies never recovered. I called the ranger station a week later, asking for Frank. The woman who answered told me no one by that name worked there. When I described him, she paused before informing me that a ranger matching that description had retired over 5 years ago following a traumatic incident in the backcountry. I never returned to the White Mountains. The divorce that had seemed so devastating before my trip now struck me as trivial compared to what I'd experienced in those woods. Life went on. I healed, physically at least. But some nights, I still wake in the darkest hours before dawn, certain I hear that rhythmic thumping circling my building. On those nights, I lie perfectly still until morning light filters through my blinds, afraid that any movement might attract attention from whatever followed me out of those ancient mountains. Because the blind man was right about one thing: it enjoys the chase, and I cannot shake the fear that one day it will find me again. My name is Tyler Bailey, and I no longer hike alone. In fact, I no longer hike at all. Some wilderness is not meant to be explored, and some hungers are never satisfied. My name is William Brown, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the White Mountains of New Hampshire last fall, during what was supposed to be a restorative weekend away from the chaos of my life in Boston. The divorce had been finalized just 3 weeks prior. Hannah had taken everything except for the hiking gear. She'd always hated our outdoor excursions. Too many bugs, she'd say, wrinkling her nose in that way that used to make my heart flutter but had eventually begun to grate on my nerves. The hiking equipment was the only thing I'd fought for in the settlement, and now I was determined to put it to good use. I needed to clear my head, to put some distance between myself and the hollow apartment that no longer felt like home. The White Mountains seemed like the perfect escape, remote, challenging, and far from any reminders of my failed marriage. I'd chosen a lesser-known trail near Mount Chocorua, one that followed along the Swift River before veering deep into Sandwich Range wilderness. According to the online forums, this route was seldom traveled this late in the season, which suited me perfectly. The solitude would do me good. The early October air had a bite to it when I arrived at the trailhead parking lot on Friday morning. Hardly anyone was around, just an elderly couple loading up their car, clearly finishing their adventure as mine was about to begin. The woman smiled warmly at me as they drove away, leaving me utterly alone. I shouldered my pack, checked my map one final time, and set off into the woods. The first few hours were exactly what I needed. The trail wasn't particularly difficult, winding gently uphill through forests ablaze with autumn colors. The sound of the Swift River cascading over rocks accompanied me, sometimes rushing loudly, other times reduced to a gentle murmur as the path veered away from the water. I stopped occasionally to drink from my canteen and take photos of particularly stunning vistas. Fiery red maples contrasted against dark green pines, golden sunlight filtering through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered about 8 miles and begun searching for a suitable campsite. The trail map had indicated a small clearing near a tributary of the Swift River, and I found it without much difficulty. It was perfect. Flat ground for my tent, a natural stone fire ring left by previous hikers, and the soothing sound of water nearby. I set up camp efficiently, my hands remembering the motions despite the months that had passed since my last trip. As dusk approached, I built a small fire and prepared a simple dinner of dehydrated chili. The temperature was dropping rapidly with the sun, and I pulled my fleece jacket tighter around myself. The flames cast dancing shadows among the trees, and for the first time since arriving, I felt a strange unease. It was nothing specific, just the natural wariness that comes from being alone in the wilderness as darkness falls. I tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the stars that had begun to appear overhead. Without city light pollution, the night sky in the White Mountains was truly spectacular. I identified a few constellations, remembering how Hannah had never been able to see the patterns I pointed out. "They're just dots, Will," she'd say, exasperated. The memory stung less than it would have a few weeks ago. I was about to turn in when I first heard it, a sound that didn't belong, not the familiar rustle of small nocturnal creatures or the whisper of wind through pine needles, but something else, something deliberate. A snap of a branch that seemed too loud, too intentional to be caused by wildlife. I froze, my mug of tea halfway to my lips, and listened intently. For several long minutes there was nothing but the soft crackling of my fire and the distant murmur of the stream. I was beginning to think I'd imagined it when it came again. Definitely footsteps, heavier than a deer or fox moving with purpose through the underbrush. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Anyone there?" No response came, but the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I reached for my flashlight and swept its beam in a wide arc around my campsite. The light caught only trees, rocks, and undergrowth. Nothing unusual, nothing that shouldn't be there. But something was there. I could feel it as surely as I could feel the cold night air on my face, a presence watching me from just beyond the circle of firelight. "I know someone's there," I called again, working to keep the tremor out of my voice. "If you're a hiker who's lost their way, I've got food and water to share." Again, nothing. I added another log to the fire, building it higher than I normally would have. The extra light and heat provided little comfort. Eventually, fatigue won out over vigilance. I secured my food in a bear canister and retreated to my tent, zipping myself securely inside. I placed my knife and flashlight beside my sleeping bag, within easy reach. Despite my exhaustion, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by every small sound from the forest around me. I awoke with a start in the pre-dawn darkness, heart pounding, though I couldn't recall what had woken me. My watch read 5:17 a.m. The forest was silent, too silent. No birdsong, no rustling of leaves, no chattering squirrels. Nothing but an oppressive, waiting stillness. Then I noticed the smell. A foul, rotten odor had seeped into my tent, like wet decay and something sulfurous. My first wild thought was that a bear had found my food cache, but I quickly dismissed this. The bear canister was designed to be impenetrable, and besides, this smell was different. Worse, unnatural. I reached for my flashlight and knife, my fingers clumsy with sleep and growing fear. The beam of light revealed nothing unusual inside the tent. I steeled myself and unzipped the door just enough to peer outside. My campsite appeared undisturbed. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to make out the shapes of trees and rocks. My backpack still hung from the branch where I'd left it. The bear canister sat undisturbed, and then I saw it. A figure standing motionless at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by a large pine tree. I couldn't make out details in the dim light, but it appeared to be a person. They stood completely still, watching my tent. "Hey," I called, my voice hoarse. "What are you doing?" The figure didn't respond or move. It remained perfectly still, as if it were part of the forest itself. I fumbled for my cell phone, though I knew from earlier attempts that I had no service this deep in the wilderness. Still, the phone's flashlight was stronger than my small camping light. I turned it on and directed the beam toward the figure. The clearing was empty. Wherever or whatever had been standing there moments before was gone, vanished without a sound. I scanned the entire perimeter of my campsite, the powerful beam cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, but found nothing. Sleep was out of the question now. I emerged from my tent and rebuilt the fire, grateful for the first hints of daylight appearing in the eastern sky. As I waited for the water to boil for coffee, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Perhaps it had been a deer, its shape distorted by shadows and my sleep-addled brain. Or maybe another hiker had wandered by, realized my camp was occupied, and moved on. Neither explanation felt right, but they were better than the alternatives my imagination was conjuring. With daylight came a return of normal forest sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the wind rustling through leaves. The oppressive feeling of being watched had diminished, though not entirely disappeared. I decided to continue my planned route rather than return the way I'd come. The next segment would take me deeper into the Sandwich Range wilderness, toward a series of small mountain ponds where I planned to camp for my second night. I broke camp efficiently, eager to be moving. As I shouldered my pack, I noticed something odd about the ground where I'd seen the figure standing. The pine needles and leaf litter appeared disturbed, pressed down in a rough oval shape. But there were no distinct footprints, no clear sign of what had stood there. The trail grew steeper and less defined as I hiked, requiring more concentration. This was good. It kept my mind occupied and away from dwelling on the previous night's strangeness. By mid-morning, I'd climbed to a ridge that offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. The autumn foliage spread below me like a multicolored carpet, and for a while, I forgot my unease, captivated by the natural beauty. It was while taking photos from this vantage point that I noticed the cairn, a stack of flat stones balanced with obvious human precision. Such markers were common on trails, but this one stood apart, larger and more elaborate than typical trail cairns. Curious, I approached it. The stones were ordinary enough, local granite and schist arranged in a tapering tower about 3 feet high. But something about their placement seemed off. Instead of the usual pile meant to mark a trail, these stones were arranged with spaces between them, creating what almost looked like a small shelter or dwelling. and wedged between two of the larger rocks was a small object that caught the sunlight, a tarnished silver pendant. I hesitated before touching it. There was something distinctly unsettling about finding jewelry abandoned on a remote hiking trail. Still, my curiosity won out. I carefully extracted the pendant from its place. It was an old-fashioned locket, oval-shaped and decorated with intricate engravings that had darkened with age. The clasp was stiff, but eventually gave way under my persistent fingers. Inside was a tiny photograph, faded almost to invisibility, of what appeared to be a young woman. On the opposite side of the locket's interior, something was etched into the metal. E.H. 1879. Below that, barely legible. Returned to Lonesome Lake. A chill ran through me despite the warm autumn sun. Lonesome Lake was indeed a real place in the White Mountains, but it was nowhere near my current location. It lay at least 15 miles to the north, near Franconia Notch. Why would someone leave this old locket here, with an inscription referencing a distant lake? I should have left it there. Every instinct told me to replace the locket exactly as I'd found it and continue on my way. Instead, I slipped it into my pocket, telling myself I would research its history when I returned to civilization. Perhaps it held historical significance. Perhaps it belonged in a local museum. Perhaps I was making a terrible mistake. The sky, which had been perfectly clear all morning, began to change as I descended from the ridge. Clouds rolled in with unnatural speed, thick and dark, bringing with them a drop in temperature that had me reaching for my jacket. The forest, which had seemed so alive and vibrant earlier, grew oddly quiet, the birds falling silent as if in anticipation of something. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to reach the mountain ponds and set up camp before the weather turned. The trail became more difficult to follow, overgrown in places as if seldom used. Twice I had to backtrack after losing the path entirely. It was during one of these backtracking episodes that I realized something was wrong with my compass. The needle spun lazily, settling in different directions each time I checked it. I pulled out my phone to use its digital compass, only to find it completely dead, despite having been at 70% battery just an hour earlier. A creeping sense of dread began to build as I forced myself to remain calm and use the sun's position to orient myself. But even this proved difficult as the thick clouds now obscured the sky entirely. The forest had grown dark, as if late evening rather than mid-afternoon. I was not lost, I told myself firmly. I had simply veered off the marked trail. If I continued heading east, I would eventually intersect with either the main trail or the highway that ran through Crawford Notch. I just needed to keep my wits about me. But the forest seemed to have other ideas. No matter which direction I walked, the trees looked identical, the terrain unchanging. I began to suspect I was walking in circles, though I couldn't see how that was possible given my careful attention to maintaining a straight path. It was then that I heard the voice, so faint at first that I thought it was just the wind. A woman's voice, soft and distant, calling what sounded like a name. I strained to listen, turning slowly to determine the direction. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there? I'm a bit turned around. Could use some help with directions." The voice came again, slightly clearer this time, though I still couldn't make out the words. It seemed to be coming from my left, deeper into the forest rather than toward where I believed the trail to be. Common sense told me to ignore it, to continue in the direction I believed would lead me back to the trail. But something about that voice pulled at me, creating an almost irresistible urge to follow. What if it was another hiker in trouble? What if they needed help? I compromised, moving cautiously in the direction of the voice while marking my path by breaking small branches and turning over distinctive rocks, breadcrumbs I could follow back if necessary. The forest grew denser, the trees closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block what little daylight remained. The ground became increasingly uneven, riddled with exposed roots and sudden drops. The voice continued, sometimes seeming to come from ahead, sometimes from behind or beside me, yet always just distinct enough to make me think I was getting closer. I'm not sure how long I walked this way, chasing that elusive voice through the increasingly unfamiliar forest. Time seemed to stretch and distort, minutes blending into what might have been hours. The light continued to fade, though whether from the thick cloud cover or the approaching evening, I couldn't tell. I was about to give up, to turn around and try to follow my markers back to where I'd first heard the voice, when I stumbled into a small clearing and stopped short. In the center of the clearing stood a cabin, or what remained of one. The structure was ancient, its log walls partially collapsed, its roof long gone. What little remained was blackened, as if the cabin had burned at some point in the distant past. Nature had begun to reclaim it, with vines creeping up the remaining walls and small saplings growing through what had once been the floor. The voice had gone silent. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. Common sense told me to turn back immediately. Nothing good could come from exploring an abandoned, burned cabin in the middle of nowhere. But the locket weighed heavy in my pocket, and a morbid curiosity drove me forward, step by reluctant step. The cabin's door had long since rotted away, leaving a dark opening that seemed to swallow what little light remained in the day. I switched on my flashlight and directed its beam inside. The interior was largely empty, just rotted floorboards and debris. In one corner stood the rusted remains of what might have been a wood stove. Along one wall, a collapsed wooden frame suggested a bed had once stood there. I was about to turn away when my light caught something on the far wall, markings that didn't appear natural. I stepped carefully across the rotten floor, testing each board before putting my full weight on it. The wall was covered with carvings, crude but deliberate symbols and words etched into the wood. Some I recognized as protection symbols, similar to those I'd seen in books about New England folklore. Others were unfamiliar, jagged designs that hurt my eyes to look at directly. Among the symbols were names, dozens of them, carved in different hands as if added over many years. And at the center of this macabre collection, larger than the rest, Elizabeth Hayward, 1879. The locket in my pocket suddenly felt like it was burning against my thigh. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out and looked again at the initials inside. E.H., 1879. Elizabeth Hayward. A sudden gust of wind blew through the cabin, stirring up dust and debris. The temperature, already cool, plummeted so rapidly that my breath became visible in white clouds before my face. The smell came back. That same rotten, sulfurous odor I'd noticed at my campsite the previous night. I backed toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to run. But before I could make it outside, something moved in the corner of the cabin. My flashlight beam revealed nothing, yet I could distinctly hear something shifting, breathing. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice high and tight with fear. In response, a low moan emanated from the darkest corner of the cabin, a sound of such profound anguish that it raised the hair on my arms. The beam of my flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging me into near-total darkness. In that moment of blindness, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the rotted floorboards toward me. I fumbled with my flashlight, shaking it desperately, but it remained dead. "Please," I whispered, though to whom or what I wasn't sure. The footsteps stopped directly in front of me. I could feel a presence there, could sense someone or something standing mere inches away. The cold intensified until it felt like my very bones were freezing. And then came the whisper, directly in my ear, so close I could feel the breath, except it wasn't breath, it was more like the wind through dead leaves. "You have what's mine. You must return it. Lonesome Lake awaits." I ran. I didn't care about the rotten floorboards or the darkness. I crashed through the doorway and into the forest, running blindly, branches whipping at my face and arms, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea which direction I was heading. All that mattered was getting away from that cabin and the thing inside it. I'm not sure how long I ran before exhaustion forced me to stop. My lungs burned, and my legs trembled with fatigue. I collapsed against a large tree trunk, struggling to catch my breath as I scanned the deepening darkness around me. There was no sign of pursuit, no sound except my own ragged breathing and the distant call of a night bird. I was hopelessly lost now, with no trail, no compass, and no phone, and night was falling rapidly. With shaking hands, I tried my flashlight again. To my immense relief, it flickered to life, its beam seeming weak but functional. I took a stock of my situation. I still had my backpack with emergency supplies, including a space blanket, water, and some food. If necessary, I could survive the night in the forest and try to find my way out in the morning. As my panic subsided, rational thought began to return. The locket weighed heavy in my pocket. Whatever had happened in that cabin, this object was clearly at the center of it. The whispered words echoed in my mind. You must return it. Lonesome Lake awaits. Lonesome Lake was miles away, in an entirely different part of the White Mountains. Even if I wanted to return the locket there, and increasingly I did, I had no way of reaching it without first finding my way back to civilization. I decided my best course of action was to pick a direction and stick to it. Eventually, I had to reach either a trail or a road. The White Mountains were vast, but they were crisscrossed with hiking routes and scenic drives. I couldn't wander forever without finding some sign of human presence. Using the brightest stars just becoming visible through breaks in the clouds, I oriented myself as best I could and began walking in what I hoped was an easterly direction. The forest was fully dark now, my small flashlight beam creating a tunnel of visibility that extended only a few feet ahead. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified by my frayed nerves. I had been walking for perhaps an hour when I smelled smoke, not the acrid scent of a forest fire, but the comforting aroma of a campfire. Relief washed over me. Another hiker, someone who might have a working compass or at least knowledge of where we were. I altered my course toward the smell, moving as quickly as I dared in the darkness. Soon, I could see a faint orange glow through the trees. Definitely a campfire. I called out as I approached, not wanting to startle whoever was there. "Hello, fellow hiker needing some help here?" No response came, but the fire was clearly visible now through the trees. I emerged into a small clearing to find a neatly arranged campsite. A two-person tent, a carefully constructed fire ring with a cheerful blaze, and camping gear organized with military precision. But no camper. "Hello," I called again, turning in a full circle. "Anyone here?" The campsite appeared recently occupied. The fire was well tended, a pot of what smelled like coffee sat at its edge, and a camp chair was positioned as if someone had just stepped away momentarily. I should have been relieved to find such a well-appointed campsite. Instead, a creeping dread began to build in my stomach. Something felt wrong. The organization was too perfect, too precise. And where was the camper? I approached the fire, drawn by its warmth after hours in the increasingly cold forest. A logbook sat on a flat rock beside the camp chair. Perhaps it contained information about the camper's identity or planned route. The book was old, its leather cover cracked and weathered. I opened it carefully, directing my flashlight at its yellowed pages. The entries dated back decades, the handwriting styles changing as I flipped through. Each entry contained a name, a date, and a brief message. The most recent entry, dated just one day earlier, read, "Daniel Koenig, October 12th. Seeking Elizabeth. Getting closer." My blood ran cold. Elizabeth, the same name carved in the cabin wall, the presumed owner of the locket that now seemed to burn in my pocket. This couldn't be coincidence. I was about to close the book when movement caught my eye, a shadow passing between trees at the edge of the firelight. I looked up quickly. "Hello, Daniel. Is that you?" At first, there was no response, no further movement. Then a figure stepped into the clearing. A man, tall and gaunt, dressed in hiking clothes that seemed oddly dated. His beard was long and unkempt, his eyes deep-set and hollow. He moved with a strange stiffness, as if his joints didn't quite work properly. "You're not Daniel," I said, stating the obvious as fear began to crawl up my spine. The man tilted his head, studying me with those hollow eyes. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as if rarely used. "No. Daniel has gone to join Elizabeth." A pause. Then, "As will you, if you don't return what you've taken." My hand instinctively went to the pocket containing the locket. "I don't understand. What's happening here? Who are you?" The man took a step closer, the firelight casting strange shadows across his gaunt face. "I am the Keeper. I watch over those who are lost. I guide them to where they belong." His eyes dropped to my pocket. "You have taken something that must be returned." "The locket," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I found it in a cairn. I was going to research it when I got back to town." The Keeper shook his head slowly. "It does not belong to you, nor to any museum. It belongs to Elizabeth, and she has waited long enough." "Elizabeth Hayward? From 1879? She must be long dead." A terrible smile spread across the Keeper's face, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Death is not always the end in these mountains. Some remain, bound by tragedy, by unfinished business." He gestured to the forest around us. "These woods hold many secrets, many souls who cannot rest." "And Daniel?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "The man who wrote in this logbook yesterday? He sought Elizabeth for many years. Now he has found her." The Keeper's hollow eyes bored into mine. "As I said, the locket must be returned to Lonesome Lake. That is where she waits. That is where she died." I pulled the locket from my pocket, holding it out in my trembling palm. "Take it then. Take it back to her." The Keeper made no move to accept it. "I cannot. The one who takes must be the one who returns. Those are the rules that bind us all. You expect me to hike to Lonesome Lake, miles from here, to return this locket to some ghost? If you wish to leave these woods alive, yes." I laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "And how exactly am I supposed to find my way there when I'm completely lost? My compass doesn't work. My phone is dead." "I will guide you," the Keeper interrupted. "One night's journey, if we leave now." "Leave now? It's the middle of the night. That's insane." The Keeper's expression didn't change. "More insane than what you've already witnessed? More insane than what will happen if you remain here, holding what is hers." As if in answer to his question, the fire suddenly flared, shooting sparks high into the night sky. The flames twisted into unnatural shapes, forms that almost resembled writhing human figures. The smell of sulfur returned, stronger than before. "Okay," I said quickly. "Okay, we'll go now. Just make that stop." The Keeper nodded once, and the fire immediately returned to normal. He turned without another word and began walking into the darkness beyond the clearing. I hesitated only briefly before grabbing my backpack and following, the locket clutched tightly in my hand. Thus began the most surreal night of my life. The Keeper moved through the forest with unnatural ease, never stumbling despite the darkness, never hesitating at forks in the non-existent path. I struggled to keep up, my flashlight beam bobbing wildly as I navigated around trees and over fallen logs. The forest seemed to change as we walked. The trees grew taller, older, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. Mist rose from the ground, swirling around our legs. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness. Whispers, laughter, occasionally a distant scream that made my skin crawl. "What happened to her?" I asked after we had been walking for what felt like hours. "To Elizabeth Hayward?" The Keeper didn't slow or turn as he answered. "She drowned in Lonesome Lake in the autumn of 1879. Her fiancé had given her the locket as an engagement gift. When her body was recovered, the locket was missing." "And that's why she can't rest? Because of a piece of jewelry? It is not the object itself, but what it represents. A promise broken, a love unfulfilled. The keeper ducked under a low-hanging branch. The locket was taken from her body before it was found, stolen by a hiker who happened upon her as she drowned but did nothing to save her. For nearly 150 years, her spirit has searched for it. And Daniel, the man who wrote in the logbook? The keeper was silent for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than before. Daniel was a descendant of Elizabeth's fiancé. He learned of the family history, of the missing locket and the curse it brought. He spent years searching these mountains for it, hoping to break the cycle of tragedy that had plagued his family for generations. Did he find it? No. He found Elizabeth. The implication hung in the air between us. I didn't ask any more questions after that. We walked for what must have been hours, though time seemed meaningless in that strange night journey. The landscape changed gradually, the dense forest giving way to more open terrain as we climbed. Eventually, we crested a ridge, and the keeper stopped. "There," he said, pointing to a dark expanse below us. "Lonesome Lake." In the faint pre-dawn light, I could just make out the smooth surface of water reflecting the paling sky. We had somehow traversed miles of mountainous terrain in a single night, a journey that should have been impossible. "Take the path down," the keeper instructed. "Wade into the water at the eastern shore. Drop the locket where the water reaches your chest. Speak her name as you release it." I looked at him, suddenly reluctant to leave his strange but familiar presence for the unknown waiting below. "You're not coming with me?" "My task was to guide you here. What happens next is between you and Elizabeth." He took a step back, beginning to fade into the lingering darkness of the forest edge. "Make no mistake, she will be waiting for you." Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me alone on the ridge overlooking the lake. The eastern sky was lightening further, the first rays of sun just beginning to touch the highest peaks. Dawn was approaching, but the lake below remained in shadow, dark and still. I took a deep breath and began the descent, following a narrow, winding path that seemed to have been worn by countless feet over many years. As I drew closer to the water, mist rose from its surface, thick and otherworldly in the half-light. The eastern shore was marked by a small pebbly beach, surprising in its normalcy after the night's supernatural journey. I paused at the water's edge, the locket heavy in my palm. The lake was utterly still, not a ripple disturbing its glassy surface despite the light breeze I could feel on my face. I removed my boots and socks, rolled up my pants, and waded in. The water was shockingly cold, numbing my feet almost instantly. Still, I pressed on, moving deeper until the water reached my knees, then my waist. The lake bottom dropped away suddenly, forcing me to swim the last few yards to where I judged the water would be chest deep if I could stand. Treading water, I held up the locket one last time. In the growing light of dawn, the tarnished silver gleamed dully. Such a small thing to cause so much suffering over so many years. "Elizabeth Hayward," I said, my voice sounding loud in the perfect stillness of the lake. "I return what was taken from you." I opened my fingers, letting the locket fall. It hit the water with barely a splash and disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. The lake remained still. The mist continued to swirl around me, and the only sound was my own breathing and the gentle splash of my movements as I treaded water. Then the surface of the lake began to glow, a soft blue light spreading outward from where the locket had sunk. The glow intensified, illuminating the mist from below and creating an ethereal scene that both terrified and mesmerized me. A figure began to form in the mist above the glowing water, the translucent outline of a young woman in old-fashioned clothing, her hair floating around her as if underwater despite being well above the lake's surface. Her features were delicate, her expression serene, but sad. Elizabeth Hayward looked exactly like the faded photograph in the locket. She regarded me silently for a long moment, then nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement or perhaps gratitude. The glow began to fade, and with it her form became less distinct, dissolving back into mist. Just before she disappeared completely, I heard a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Free. The mist dissipated rapidly as the first direct rays of sunlight touched the lake. Within minutes, Lonesome Lake looked entirely ordinary, just a beautiful mountain pond reflecting the morning sky. I swam back to shore, suddenly aware of how cold and exhausted I was. As I emerged from the water, I noticed something that hadn't been visible in the pre-dawn darkness. A well-maintained trail marker indicating the path to Franconia Notch, where I knew there would be a ranger station and, eventually, a way back to civilization. The events of the past 24 hours already seemed dreamlike, fading at the edges like the morning mist. Had I really encountered a ghost, been guided through impossible miles of forest by an otherworldly keeper, or had I merely gotten lost, suffered from exposure and exhaustion, and somehow stumbled upon Lonesome Lake by coincidence? Even now, years later, I can't say with certainty what happened in the White Mountains that October weekend. I know only that I made my way back to the ranger station, was treated for mild hypothermia and exhaustion, and eventually returned to my life in Boston. I never went hiking alone again. Some paths are not meant to be walked in solitude, and some stories from the wilderness remain untold for good reason. The White Mountains keep their secrets well, but occasionally they reveal them to those who stray from the marked trails, those who, by chance or fate, become entangled in histories long forgotten by the living. Elizabeth Hayward found her rest. Daniel Koenig was never found. And somewhere in those ancient forests, I believe the keeper still walks, guiding the lost to where they need to go, whether they want to arrive there or not. My name is William Brown, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the White Mountains of New Hampshire last fall, when the leaves were turning and the air had that crisp edge to it that whispers of the coming winter. I've always been something of a loner. After my divorce, I threw myself into my work as a software developer. Long hours in front of screens, takeout dinners, and weekends spent in the blue glow of my monitor. My therapist suggested I needed to reconnect with the natural world. She called it grounding, said it would help with my anxiety and the panic attacks that had been growing more frequent. I laughed it off at first, but after waking up at 3 a.m. for the 5th night in a row, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to escape, I decided maybe she had a point. I chose the Pemigewasset Wilderness for my solo adventure. It's deep in the White Mountain National Forest, far enough from civilization to feel like a proper escape, but with established trails so a novice like me wouldn't end up as a cautionary tale on the evening news. The area around Mount Carrigain was supposed to be beautiful in autumn, vibrant foliage, breathtaking vistas, and enough isolation to finally clear my head. I prepared meticulously, new gear from REI, trail maps downloaded on my phone with backup paper copies, enough food for 5 days even though I'd only be out for 3. I even took a wilderness first aid course. Nothing was going to go wrong because I'd planned for every contingency. What I couldn't plan for was Eleanor. My first day on the trail was everything I'd hoped for. The exertion of the hike burned away the cobwebs in my mind, and the scenery was spectacular. A cathedral of red and gold leaves, sunlight filtering through in shafts that seemed almost solid enough to touch. By late afternoon, I'd reached a small clearing near Carrigain Brook that seemed perfect for setting up camp. As I was securing my tent, I heard the snap of a twig behind me. I turned to find an elderly woman standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. She was tiny, couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, and impossibly thin, dressed in what looked like homemade clothes that hung from her frame. Her white hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was a map of deep wrinkles. But her eyes were startlingly bright and alert. "You shouldn't be camping here," she said without preamble. Her voice was stronger than I expected, with the distinctive nasal quality of a New England accent. "Excuse me?" I straightened up, embarrassed at how much she'd startled me. "This clearing. It's not safe." She gestured vaguely at the ground around me. "There's a better spot about half a mile up the trail." I glanced down at my half-assembled tent. "I've already started setting up, and it'll be dark soon. This spot seems fine." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Suit yourself, but don't say Eleanor didn't warn you." She turned to go, then paused. "If you hear anything in the night, anything at all, don't answer it, no matter what it sounds like." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, moving through the underbrush with surprising agility for someone her age. I stood there for a moment, unsettled, before shaking it off as the eccentricity of a local who probably didn't appreciate hikers in her woods. I finished setting up camp and cooked a simple meal as darkness fell. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun was gone, and I was grateful for my new down sleeping bag as I zipped myself into the tent. Despite my earlier unease, the exhaustion of the day's hike soon pulled me towards sleep. It must have been around midnight when I woke with a start. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it again. A voice, distant but clear, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help." It was a man's voice, panicked and pained. I sat up, instantly alert, heart thumping. Someone was in trouble. I fumbled for my headlamp and was about to unzip my tent when I remembered Eleanor's warning. "If you hear anything in the night, anything at all, don't answer it, no matter what it sounds like." I hesitated, my hand on the zipper. "Please, I'm hurt. I can see your tent. Please help me." The voice was closer now, and there was something off about it. The cadence wasn't quite right, like someone trying to remember how humans speak when frightened. And despite claiming to be injured, the voice moved too quickly, covering ground faster than someone with an injury should be able to. I sat frozen, my breath misting in the cold air of the tent. William, is that you in there? It's me, buddy. Open up." My blood turned to ice. I hadn't told anyone my name. Not a single person knew exactly where I was camping. The voice was right outside my tent now, and with it came a smell, like wet earth and decaying leaves, but underneath that, something sickly sweet and rotten. "William, come on, man. I can see you in there. Just open the door. I'm bleeding out here." The fabric of my tent bulged inward, as if someone was pressing against it, but the shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs at odd angles. I pressed myself against the far side of the tent, clapping a hand over my mouth to stifle my breathing. Minutes stretched like hours as the thing outside continued to call to me, its voice cycling through different tones and timbres as if trying to find one that would make me respond. Eventually, as the eastern sky began to lighten, the presence withdrew. I heard movement through the underbrush growing fainter until it was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally broke fully, I emerged from my tent on shaky legs, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing in some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination. But the ground around my tent told a different story. The pine needles and leaves had been disturbed in a wide circle, as if something had paced around and around my small shelter all night. And in one spot, the earth was gouged with marks that looked disturbingly like enormous, elongated fingerprints. I broke camp in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the tent poles. I needed to get out of there, back to civilization and away from whatever had visited me in the night. I would find Eleanor, ask her what she knew. The trail, she'd mentioned, half a mile up, I would go there first. It took me less than 15 minutes of hard hiking to find the spot she must have meant. It was another clearing, similar to the one I'd camped in but ringed with large boulders. There was an old fire pit in the center, stones arranged in a perfect circle with the remains of charred wood inside. It looked like it had been used recently. I dropped my pack and looked around for any sign of Eleanor. Nothing. I called out a few times, but only the whisper of wind through the trees answered me. After catching my breath, I realized I had a decision to make. Continue with my planned route, which would take me deeper into the wilderness for another 2 days, or cut my losses and hike back out the way I'd come. The rational part of me said to leave. Whatever had happened last night had left me badly shaken. But another part, a stubborn part I didn't fully recognize, wanted answers. I decided to stay, at least for one more night. I would camp here, in Eleanor's recommended spot, and see if I could find her in the morning. If nothing happened overnight, I'd continue with my original plan. If something did, well, I'd deal with that when it came. I set up camp with several hours of daylight left, which gave me time to explore the immediate area. About 50 yards from the clearing, I found a small stream trickling over moss-covered rocks. The water was crystal clear and ice cold. I filled my bottles and used my filter, though the water looked clean enough to drink straight. As I was crouched by the stream, I noticed something half buried in the soft mud of the bank, a small figurine, no bigger than my thumb. I dug it out carefully and rinsed it off. It was carved from what looked like antler or bone, depicting a thin, elongated human figure with a featureless face. The craftsmanship was intricate, with tiny notches running down its spine. It was unsettling, but beautiful in its way. I should have left it there. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me to put it back, but instead, I slipped it into my pocket. It might help me find answers. When I returned to my campsite, I found I wasn't alone. Eleanor sat on one of the boulders ringing the clearing, watching me with those bright, alert eyes. "You moved," she said, approval in her voice. "Smart boy." "What happened last night?" I asked without preamble. "What was that thing?" She sighed, suddenly looking every one of her many years. "Sit down, William. This isn't a quick explanation." I sat on a boulder opposite her, trying not to show how unnerved I was that she knew my name. Had I told her yesterday? I couldn't remember doing so. "These mountains are old," she began, her gaze drifting to the tree line. "Older than any building, older than any road or town, and old places have old things living in them." "What kind of things?" Her eyes snapped back to mine. "Hungry things, lonely things, things that remember when humans were prey, not predators." She leaned forward. "The Abenaki people who lived here first had many names for them. The colonists who came later called them different names: Wendigo, Skinwalker, Forest Devil. Names don't matter much. What matters is knowing how to avoid their attention." I pulled the bone figurine from my pocket and held it up. "Like this." Eleanor's face went slack with shock, then hardened into anger. "Where did you get that?" "By the stream. It was half buried in the mud." She stood abruptly and crossed to me, snatching the figurine from my hand. "Fool, these are markers, warnings. Taking one is like tearing down a no trespassing sign and waving it in the owner's face. I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know." She examined the figurine closely, turning it over in her gnarled fingers. "This one's old, very old. It still might work." "What might work?" Instead of answering, she pulled a small leather pouch from inside her clothing and extracted something that glinted in the fading light. A thin, curved needle that looked to be made of the same material as the figurine. Before I could react, she grabbed my hand and jabbed the needle into the pad of my thumb. "Ow! What the hell?" I jerked back, but she held my hand firmly, squeezing until a fat drop of blood welled up. She pressed the figurine against the blood, coating the featureless face with it. "There," she said, releasing me. "Now it knows you're under protection." I nursed my throbbing thumb, anger overtaking fear. "That's assault. You can't just stab people." Eleanor ignored my outburst. "You need to leave these woods. Now. Tonight. Don't wait until morning." "I can't hike out in the dark," I protested. "I'll get lost." "Better lost than found by what's hunting you now." She pressed the bloodied figurine back into my hand. "Keep this with you. Don't lose it." She looked up at the darkening sky. "I have to go. My own protections only work in daylight." "Wait," I called as she turned to leave. "Who are you? How do you know about these things?" She paused at the edge of the clearing. "My family has lived in these mountains for 10 generations. We've learned what it takes to survive here." A sad smile crossed her wrinkled face. "I'm the last one now. The others, they forgot the old ways, or they didn't believe." She disappeared into the gathering shadows before I could ask anything else. I stood in the center of the clearing, the blood-stained figurine clutched in my hand, utterly bewildered by what had just happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss Eleanor as a deranged old woman, but I couldn't explain away what I'd heard outside my tent the night before. I decided to compromise. I wouldn't try to hike out in the dark, that seemed like a recipe for disaster, but I would be ready to leave at first light. I built a fire in the stone circle, larger than I normally would. If there really was something in these woods, maybe the fire would keep it at bay. As night fell completely, I heated water for my freeze-dried dinner but found I had little appetite. The silence of the forest was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack and pop of my fire. No insects chirping, no owls hooting, no rustling of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush. Just silence and the growing feeling that I was being watched. I kept the bone figurine in my hand, running my thumb over its smooth surface again and again. Whether it was really some kind of mystical protection or just a psychological comfort didn't matter. It helped keep my rising panic at bay. Hours passed. The fire burned down to embers. My eyelids grew heavy despite my anxiety, and I started nodding off where I sat. I should get in the tent, I thought, zip myself in, but the idea of being enclosed, trapped if something came, kept me rooted to my spot by the dying fire. I don't know when I finally dozed off, but I awoke with a violent start. The fire was completely out, and the clearing was bathed in the silver light of a nearly full moon that had risen while I slept. The air had grown so cold that each breath sent a plume of vapor into the night. Something had woken me. A sound, a presence. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the darkness beyond the boulders. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It moved, circling the clearing slowly. I clutched the figurine so tightly its edges bit into my palm. My other hand found my flashlight, but I hesitated to turn it on. Some instinct told me that to acknowledge whatever was out there would only make things worse. The tapping stopped directly across the clearing from where I sat. I could see nothing in the shadows between the trees, but I felt it watching me, a malevolent awareness that pressed against my consciousness like a physical weight. William. The voice that emerged from the darkness wasn't like the one from the previous night. It wasn't pretending to be human. It was ancient and dry, like autumn leaves crumbling to dust, with harmonics that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. "William Brown, I know your blood now." My heart hammered against my ribs. The figurine. My blood on the figurine. Somehow, impossibly, it had used that connection to learn who I was. "Eleanor cannot help you," the voice continued. "Her kind is dying. Soon there will be none left to remember the old pacts." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but sit there frozen in terror, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if my muscles had forgotten how to move. I am so hungry, William. So hungry and so very old. Something shifted in the darkness, a suggestion of impossible height, of limbs too numerous and too long. The hunger never stops, but the loneliness is worse. A branch snapped and suddenly I could move again. I scrambled backward away from the sound, my hand still clenched around the figurine. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Eleanor protected me." A sound emerged from the darkness, a dry, rattling noise that might have been laughter. Protection? No, she merely introduced us. The darkness between two trees seemed to deepen, to coalesce into something almost solid. I could make out a vague shape now, towering, skeletal, with too many joints bending in wrong directions. And where a face should be, only a blank darkness that somehow still gave the impression of watching, of smiling. "I've been alone so long," it said, its voice softer now, almost wistful. The Abenaki understood. They left offerings. They shared their stories with me. But then new people came, with their iron and their Christ God, and they forgot how to listen. A long, spindly limb emerged from the shadow shape, reaching toward me. "You'll listen, won't you, William? You'll hear my stories?" I scrambled to my feet, backing away until I hit one of the boulders ringing the clearing. "What do you want from me?" "Company," it whispered. "Just a little company. Is that so much to ask?" Its limbs stretched impossibly across the clearing, twig-like fingers reaching for my face. "Let me show you what I've seen. Let me share what I know. It only hurts at first." The tip of its finger was inches from my cheek when a voice rang out from the opposite side of the clearing. "That's enough." Eleanor stood there, illuminated in the moonlight, a flaming torch in one hand and some kind of staff in the other. She looked different, stronger, taller somehow, her white hair loose around her shoulders like a mantle of snow. The creature's attention snapped to her, its limb withdrawing so quickly it seemed to blur. "Which woman?" it hissed, the sound like wind through dead branches. "This doesn't concern you." "He's under my protection," Eleanor replied, her voice ringing with authority I hadn't heard before. "You know the rules. You cannot take what's protected. Rules change. Your people are gone, old woman. Your ways are dying." The shadow seemed to expand, growing taller, wider, filling the space between the trees. Soon there will be none left to remember the boundaries. Eleanor strode forward into the clearing, fearless. "But I'm not gone yet." She raised her staff and struck the ground with it. The sound it made was like a thunderclap, echoing off the mountains around us. "And while I live, the old pacts hold." For a long moment, nothing moved. The creature and the old woman faced each other across the moonlit clearing, locked in some silent battle of wills I couldn't comprehend. I could only watch, the bone figurine cutting into my palm as I clutched it like a lifeline. Finally, the shadow thing seemed to shrink, folding in on itself. "This isn't over," it said, its voice fading. "I am patient. I can wait." "Then wait you shall," Eleanor replied, "but not for him." The darkness between the trees returned to normal, and suddenly I could hear the forest again, the whisper of wind, the distant hoot of an owl. The oppressive presence was gone. I slumped against the boulder, my legs giving out. What was that?" I managed to ask. Eleanor came to me, moving with the fluid grace of someone half her apparent age. "Something old? Something hungry?" She helped me to my feet with surprising strength. "And now, something angry. It said you introduced us. What did it mean?" She wouldn't meet my eyes. I needed to know if it was still here, if it was still hunting. She tapped the figurine in my hand. These were how my grandmother taught me to check. If it takes the bait... Understanding dawned, cold and horrifying. "You used me as bait? You put my blood on this thing to what? Draw it out?" "To confirm what I feared," she said, and at least she had the decency to look ashamed. "I'm sorry. I needed to be sure. I wanted to be angry, but I was too exhausted, too frightened. Is it gone now?" "For tonight. The binding I used will hold until dawn." She took my arm. "But we need to move. Once the sun rises, it will hunt again." "What is the binding? How does any of this work?" I asked as she led me back to my campsite. Questions later. Pack now. I didn't argue. I broke camp with Eleanor's help, stuffing things haphazardly into my backpack. She seemed to be in a hurry, constantly glancing at the eastern horizon as if worried about how much time we had left. "Where are we going?" I asked as I shouldered my pack. My cabin. It's not far." She pointed to a trail I hadn't noticed before, barely visible in the pre-dawn light. "Hurry, it knows your blood now. It won't give up easily." We hiked in silence as the sky gradually lightened. Eleanor moved with surprising speed for someone her age, never pausing for rest. The trail she led me along wasn't on any of my maps. A narrow, overgrown path that twisted through the forest in ways that seemed to defy the landscape's natural contours. "This doesn't make sense," I said after we'd been walking for maybe an hour. "We should have hit the Caretaker Notch trail by now." "We're not on your hiking trails," Eleanor replied without slowing. "This is an old way, my family's way." I wanted to press her for more information, but something in her tone discouraged questions. We continued in silence as the forest grew brighter around us, morning mist rising from the ground in ghostly tendrils. Eventually, the trees thinned, and we emerged into a small meadow. In its center stood a cabin that looked like it had grown organically from the forest floor. Weathered gray wood with a moss-covered roof, smoke curling from a stone chimney. A small garden plot stood to one side, and what looked like animal pelts were stretched on frames near the door. "Home?" Eleanor said simply, leading me toward it. The interior of the cabin was a single large room with a loft above. It was cluttered but clean, filled with an eclectic collection of items that spoke of a life lived close to the land. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters, shelves lined with jars of preserved foods, handmade furniture worn smooth with age and use. A fire burned in a large stone hearth, casting wavering light over everything. "Sit," Eleanor commanded, pointing to a chair by the fire. As I sank into it gratefully, she busied herself at a small kitchen area, returning moments later with 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to me. "Drink. It will help with the shock." The liquid was dark and bitter, with an undertone of sweetness and unfamiliar spices. I sipped it cautiously, then more deeply as warmth spread through my chest. "What happens now?" I asked after the silence had stretched too long. Eleanor settled into a chair opposite me, her bright eyes studying my face. "Now you listen, and you believe what I tell you, and because your life depends on it." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. "What you encountered is known by many names, as I said before. My grandmother called it the Hungry Shadow. The colonists had other names for it. None of them matter." She took a sip from her mug. "What matters is that it's ancient. It's powerful, and it wants something from you. It said it wanted company." Eleanor's expression darkened. "Yes, that's how it begins. It's lonely. That much is true. The Abenaki understood how to live with it, how to appease it with offerings and stories. But then they were driven out, and the knowledge was lost." She leaned forward. "It takes people, William. Not their bodies, their essence, their stories, their memories. It consumes them bit by bit until there's nothing left but an empty shell that still walks and talks." A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the fire. "Why did you use me to draw it out?" She had the grace to look ashamed again. I needed to confirm it was still active. There have been disappearances, hikers gone missing, but no bodies found. She set down her mug. "My family has watched over this area for generations, keeping the old pacts, maintaining the wards that keep it contained to certain parts of the forest. But I'm the last one left. My children wanted nothing to do with the old ways. They moved to cities, normal lives." A shadow of old grief crossed her face. "I don't blame them." "So you're some kind of… what? Guardian?" "Caretaker might be a better word. My family made promises long ago. We've kept them as best we could." I remembered what the creature had said. "Eleanor cannot help you. Her kind is dying." It seemed to know you, to fear you even. A thin smile crossed her face. "Fear? No, but it respects the old boundaries, the old agreements. At least it has until now." She looked troubled. "It's growing bolder, hungrier. What does it want from me specifically?" "You're alone," she said simply. "Isolated, vulnerable, perfect prey. She gave me a penetrating look. And you're carrying pain, aren't you? Old wounds that haven't healed. It smells like a shark smells blood. I flinched. How could she know about my divorce, my anxiety, the emptiness that had driven me out here in the first place? The good news, she continued, is that you can leave. Return to your life. The connection it has through your blood is strong but limited by distance. If you go far enough away, it won't be able to follow. And the bad news? It doesn't give up easily. It might send dreams, visions, try to lure you back. She reached across and tapped the bone figurine I still held. Keep this with you. It will help blur the connection, make it harder for the thing to find your mind. I stared down at the unsettling carving. What if I don't want to just run away? What if I want to help somehow? Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with something like respect. Brave words, but this isn't your fight. You said yourself you're the last of your family. What happens when... I trailed off, not wanting to be crass. When I die, she finished bluntly. Then the pacts will weaken, the boundaries will blur, and it will feed more freely. She sighed heavily. I've tried to find someone to pass the knowledge to. No one stays, no one believes. A thought occurred to me. Is that why you were out there, looking for someone to take your place? She gave me a long, measuring look. Perhaps. But not everyone is suited to this life. She gestured around the cabin. It's lonely, isolated. Like me, I said quietly. Like you, she agreed. But there's a difference between being alone because life has wounded you and choosing solitude as a calling. She stood abruptly. Rest now. We'll talk more when you've had some sleep. You're safe here. My cabin is warded in ways the thing cannot breach. I didn't argue. Now that the immediate danger had passed, exhaustion washed over me in waves. Eleanor showed me to a small alcove with a narrow bed, and I barely managed to remove my boots before collapsing onto it. My sleep was deep but troubled by strange dreams. Forests that breathed, shadows with too many limbs, ancient voices whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear but somehow understood. And through it all, a sense of terrible loneliness, a hunger that could never be satisfied. I woke to the smell of cooking food and the sound of Eleanor moving around the cabin. Late afternoon light slanted through small windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I'd slept most of the day away. You needed it, Eleanor said when I emerged from the alcove, answering my unspoken thought. Sit. Eat. She nodded toward the table where a bowl of stew and a chunk of dark bread waited. The food was simple but delicious, venison and root vegetables in a rich broth. I ate ravenously, suddenly aware of how little I'd consumed in the past 24 hours. I've been thinking, Eleanor said as she sat across from me with her own bowl, about what happens when I'm gone. I paused with my spoon halfway to my mouth. And I think perhaps you were sent here for a reason. She held up a hand as I started to protest. Not by any god or fate, I have no time for such notions, but by your own needs, which align with mine. I don't understand. You came to these woods seeking something, didn't you? Not just a hiking trip, something deeper. I set down my spoon, uncomfortable with how easily she seemed to read me. My therapist thought it would help with my anxiety. Getting back to nature, or something like that. Eleanor snorted. Therapy. They have names for everything these days, don't they? But no pills or talking cures for the real sickness. She tapped her chest. The emptiness, the disconnection. What are you suggesting? Stay, she said simply. Learn from me. Take up the work when I'm gone. I stared at her, certain she was joking. Stay? Here? As what? Your apprentice? If you want to call it that, she shrugged. I'm offering you purpose, William. Something real. Something necessary. I have a job, an apartment, a life. Do you? Her gaze was uncomfortably direct. Or do you have routines that fill the time between sleeping and waking? Distractions that keep you from looking too deeply at the emptiness? Her words hit with the force of truth. What was waiting for me back in Boston? Days spent coding in a cubicle, evenings alone in my sterile apartment, weekends that stretched out endlessly with nothing but streaming services and takeout to fill them. No real friends since the divorce, no family nearby, nothing that would truly miss my presence. I don't know anything about any of this. I gestured vaguely, encompassing the cabin, the forest, the supernatural threat lurking within it. You can learn, if you're willing. She stood and moved to a trunk in the corner, returning with a leather-bound book. My grandmother's journal, and her grandmother's before her. The knowledge is here. It just needs someone to use it. I looked at the book, then back at her face, lined with age but filled with quiet certainty. Why me? Because you came. Because you listened. Because you saw what's out there and didn't immediately run away or try to explain it away. She pushed the book toward me. And because there's no one else. I didn't take the book. Not yet. What would it involve exactly? This caretaking. Maintaining the wards, knowing the old ways, keeping the hunger contained. She gestured toward the windows, toward the forest beyond. Living on the boundary between worlds and making sure the boundaries hold. And if I say no, then I'll guide you safely out of these woods tomorrow, and you can return to your life. She said it without judgment, but I could hear the resignation in her voice. She'd made this offer before, I realized, and been refused. I looked around the cabin, rustic but comfortable, filled with evidence of a life lived deliberately, with purpose. Then I thought of my apartment in the city, sterile and interchangeable, containing nothing that couldn't be replaced in an afternoon's shopping. Can I think about it? Eleanor nodded. Until morning. Then I need to know your choice. The rest of the evening passed in surprisingly comfortable silence. Eleanor busied herself with small tasks around the cabin while I leafed through her grandmother's journal. The writing was dense and often cryptic, interspersed with drawings of symbols and maps of the surrounding wilderness. Much of it made little sense to me, but I was struck by the dedication evident in every page, the careful observations, the meticulous records spanning decades. As night fell, Eleanor built up the fire and made tea. We sat together in the firelight, two strangers connected by an encounter with something beyond ordinary understanding. If I stayed, I said finally, breaking the silence, would I ever be able to leave? To visit the outside world? Of course, the duty is to this place, but it doesn't require constant presence. My grandmother used to go to Conway once a month for supplies. She smiled slightly. These days there's internet in Lincoln. Slow, but it works. You wouldn't be completely cut off. That surprised me. You have internet? She pointed to a small solar setup I hadn't noticed before. I'm old, not primitive. I order supplies online, pay bills, even watch Netflix sometimes. Her smile widened at my expression. What did you expect? Animal skins and stone tools? I laughed, the sound strange in my own ears after so much tension. I guess I did. The old ways and the new can coexist, she said, serious again. That's part of the caretaking, too. Adapting, surviving, ensuring the knowledge continues even as the world changes. I nodded slowly, my decision crystallizing. The emptiness I'd felt for so long, the disconnection that had driven me to these woods in the first place. Perhaps this was the answer. Not a temporary escape, but a new purpose. A life with meaning. I'll stay, I said, the words emerging with surprising certainty. At least long enough to learn, to understand what this is all about. Eleanor's face showed no triumph, only quiet satisfaction. Good, we'll begin tomorrow. That night, I slept without dreams, more peacefully than I had in years. In the morning, Eleanor showed me a hidden path that led to where I'd left my car at the trailhead days before. "You'll need to get your affairs in order," she said. "Sublet your apartment, pack what matters to you, tell people you're taking a sabbatical, moving to New Hampshire for a while." "How long do I have?" She squinted up at the sky. "It's weakened now. It will need time to recover its strength. A month should be safe." She handed me a small pouch. "Keep this with you. It will blur your trail, make it harder for it to find you if it tries to reach for your mind." The drive back to Boston was surreal. Traffic jams, coffee shops, people walking dogs, all seemed like artifacts from another life, one I was already detaching from. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see impossible shadows stretching across the highway behind me. I gave notice at my job, claiming a mental health sabbatical. My boss was surprisingly understanding. Apparently, I'd looked burnt out for months. I sublet my apartment to a colleague's cousin, packed my essential belongings into my SUV, and tied up the loose ends of my urban existence with surprising ease. It was as if I'd been prepared to leave it all behind for a long time, just waiting for the right reason. The small bone figurine stayed in my pocket throughout, a constant reminder that what I'd experienced was real. Sometimes at night, I thought I could hear whispering when I held it, fragments of stories in languages I didn't understand but somehow recognized on some primal level. I returned to Eleanor's cabin exactly 4 weeks after I'd left. The forest welcomed me with familiar sounds and smells, but now I noticed things I'd missed before. Patterns in the arrangement of certain trees, subtle markers carved into rocks along the path, the way the birds fell silent in certain areas. Eleanor was waiting for me on the porch, as if she'd known the exact moment I would arrive. Perhaps she had. "You came back," she said, no surprise in her voice. "I said I would." She nodded once, then turned and entered the cabin. "Then we begin." My education started that very afternoon. Eleanor was a demanding teacher with little patience for questions she deemed irrelevant. The work of a caretaker, I learned, was divided into 3 main areas: knowledge, maintenance, and vigilance. Knowledge meant learning the history, not just of the hungry shadow, but of the land itself. The White Mountains had been inhabited for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. The Abenaki people had developed complex relationships with the spiritual forces of the region, relationships the colonists had disrupted or destroyed in their ignorance. "The thing in the woods isn't evil," Eleanor explained as we walked the boundaries of what she called her stewardship. "Not in the way humans think of evil. It's ancient. It was here before us, and it will be here after us. It doesn't hate or love. It hungers. It needs." "Needs what?" I asked. "Connection," she said. "Stories, experiences. The shadow can't create, it can only consume, and what it consumes most eagerly are human stories." Maintenance meant tending to the network of wards and boundaries her family had established over generations. Some were physical, cairns of specifically arranged stones, carvings on old trees, figurines like the one I now carried buried at crossroads or near streams. Others were more ephemeral, songs sung at certain times of year, offerings left at specific locations, stories told to the darkness on moonless nights. Vigilance was perhaps the most difficult aspect. It meant constant awareness of the forest's rhythms, noticing when birds stopped singing in a certain area or when deer avoided a particular path. It meant learning to sense the shadow's presence before it manifested, to feel the subtle pressure it exerted on the mind. Weeks turned to months. Summer faded into autumn, then winter. The forest transformed around us, but Eleanor's lessons continued regardless of weather or season. I learned to move through the woods as she did, with quiet confidence rather than fear. I memorized the locations of every ward and marker in her territory. I studied her grandmother's journal until I could recite entire passages from memory, and all the while I felt the shadow watching, waiting. It came for me again on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. Eleanor had warned me it might. "The boundaries between worlds grow thin at the turning points of the year," she'd said. "It will test you." I was alone in the cabin. Eleanor had gone to Lincoln for supplies and wouldn't return until morning. I'd built up the fire against the bitter cold outside and was studying a particularly cryptic section of the journal when I felt it. That familiar pressure against my mind, like a weight settling on my thoughts. "I know you're there," I said aloud, closing the book. "I can feel you." The shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to deepen, to pulse with a life of their own. The fire dimmed, though no draft disturbed it. "William," came that dry, ancient voice I remembered from the clearing months ago. "You haven't forgotten me." How could I? I stood, moving to the center of the room where Eleanor had shown me the protective sigils hidden beneath the floorboards. "What do you want?" "The same as before. Company, understanding." A pause. "The old woman hasn't told you everything." I said nothing, remembering Eleanor's warnings. It could twist words, use half-truths to manipulate. "She's dying, William. Faster than she's admitted to you." The shadow's voice was almost gentle. "Did you know that?" A cold knot formed in my stomach. I had noticed Eleanor's increasing fatigue, the way she sometimes paused to catch her breath or rubbed at her chest when she thought I wasn't looking. "She's old," I said. "That's all." "Her heart is failing. She has months at most. Then you'll be alone with a burden you barely understand." The darkness between the rafters seemed to shift, to reach toward me. "I could help you. I know things she's forgotten, secrets her family lost generations ago." "In exchange for what?" "Just stories. Your stories. Memories you can spare." I could almost hear the shrug in its voice. "Everyone has experiences they'd rather forget. I can take those from you. A fair trade." For a moment I was tempted. There were memories I'd gladly be rid of. The look on my ex-wife's face when she told me she'd found someone else. The call about my parents' car accident. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, heart racing with nameless dread. If the shadow could take those away. But I remembered something Eleanor had told me. It starts with the painful memories, the ones you think you can spare. But those are part of what makes you human. Lose them and you lose pieces of yourself. Then it takes more, and more, until there's nothing left that's truly you. "No," I said firmly. "No deals." The darkness rippled, contracting. "You'll change your mind when she's gone, when you're alone." It sounded almost sad. "I'll be waiting." Then it was gone, the shadows returning to normal, the fire blazing up again as if it had never dimmed. I sat back down, hands shaking, and reached for the bone figurine in my pocket. Its familiar contours were reassuring against my fingers. When Eleanor returned the next morning, I told her what had happened. She listened without interruption, her face grave. "It's getting bolder," she said when I'd finished. "Coming to the cabin itself, that's new." I hesitated, then asked the question that had been gnawing at me since the shadow's visit. "Are you ill? Is your heart failing?" She gave me a sharp look, then sighed. "Yes. My doctor in Lincoln gives me a year, maybe less. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to pressure you." She set down the mug she'd been holding. "You can still leave, William. Find a normal life again. No one would blame you." The thought had occurred to me, especially in those first difficult months of learning. But now, after nearly half a year in these woods, I could no more abandon this place than I could cut off my own arm. "This is my life now," I said simply. "I'm staying." Relief flickered across her weathered face. "Then we need to accelerate your training. There are things you'll need to know before—" She trailed off. "Before you're gone," I finished for her. She nodded once, decisive. "Tomorrow we begin the binding rituals. They're complex, dangerous if done incorrectly, but essential. The shadow must be renewed in its constraints each spring equinox, or it will grow stronger, hungrier. The following months were the most intense of my education. Eleanor pushed herself harder than she should have, determined to pass on every scrap of knowledge before her time ran out. I learned rituals and incantations in languages that had no written form, how to read signs in the movement of birds or the patterns of ice on a frozen stream, how to navigate the strange dreamscape where the shadow was strongest. By the time the first hints of spring touched the forest, I could feel the change in Eleanor. She tired more easily, needed to rest after even short walks. The lines in her face had deepened, and sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, pain tightened her features. Yet she was determined to oversee the spring binding ritual herself, to guide me through it one time before leaving me to perform it alone in future years. We began preparations weeks in advance, gathering specific plants as they emerged from the winter ground, carving new markers to replace those damaged by frost or fallen trees, memorizing the complex patterns of the ritual itself. The equinox dawned clear and cold. We left the cabin before sunrise, making our way to a place Eleanor called the crossroads, not a literal intersection of paths, but a point where the boundary between worlds grew thin. It was marked by a circle of ancient trees, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes by forces I still didn't fully understand. In the center of the circle was a boulder, flat-topped and covered with moss except for a small depression in its center. Eleanor instructed me to build a small fire in that depression while she prepared the other elements of the ritual. As the sun crested the eastern mountains, we began. Eleanor's voice, normally hobbled by age, grew strong as she recited words in a language that made my ears hurt if I tried to focus too closely on their meaning. I followed her lead, repeating phrases, arranging objects in patterns only she fully understood, feeding the fire with bundles of herbs that sent sweet-smelling smoke into the morning air. The ritual took hours. By midday, I could feel something gathering around us, a pressure similar to what I felt when the shadow was near, but diffuse, spread throughout the forest rather than concentrated in one location. The air seemed to thicken, to vibrate with potential energy. Eleanor's face was pale with exertion, but her eyes burned with intensity as she guided me through the final stages. I added the last bundle of herbs to the fire, which flared up with unnatural blue flames. The smoke formed shapes that shouldn't have been possible, spiraling patterns that seemed to connect with invisible threads reaching out into the forest. "Now," Eleanor whispered, her voice suddenly weak. "Now, we bind it." She pricked her finger with a bone needle, similar to the one she'd used on me that first night, and let 3 drops of blood fall into the fire. Then she handed the needle to me. I didn't hesitate, piercing my own finger and adding my blood to hers. The fire flared again, higher this time, the blue flames taking on hints of red and gold. Eleanor began the final incantation, her voice rising and falling in complex patterns. I joined her, our voices twining together in the ancient words. The pressure around us intensified, became almost unbearable, and then, with an almost audible snap, released. The fire went out as if a great wind had extinguished it, though not a breath of air stirred the trees around us. The forest was utterly silent for a long moment, and then, gradually, normal sounds returned. The rustle of wind through new leaves, the distant call of a bird. "It's done," Eleanor said, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "The binding will hold for another year." I helped her back to the cabin, alarmed at how heavily she leaned on me, how labored her breathing had become. By the time we reached the porch, she could barely stand. "I need to rest," she whispered as I helped her to her bed. "Just need to rest." She slept through the remainder of the day and into the night. I sat by her bedside, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest, knowing without being told that the ritual had taken more from her than she could afford to give. Just before dawn, she woke, her eyes clear and alert in a way they hadn't been for weeks. "William," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the day before. "There's one more thing I need to tell you, something I've kept from you." I leaned closer. What is it? The shadow. It wasn't always as it is now. Once, long ago, it was something different. Something less hungry, less dangerous. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. My ancestors, they changed it, bound it too tightly, took too much from it in their fear. I don't understand, I said, though a cold suspicion was forming. The rituals we perform, the bindings, they're necessary now, but they're also what's causing its pain, its desperate hunger. Her eyes held mine, unflinching. We did this to it, William, my family. We broke something that was whole, and now we must bear the responsibility for what it's become. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All these months I'd thought of the shadow as a malevolent entity, a predator to be contained. But what if it was a victim as well? What if its hunger, its loneliness, were the result of wounds inflicted by humans? Why tell me this now? I asked. Because someday you might find a better way. A way to heal what was broken, not just contain it. She reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. The journals contain hints, things my grandmother suspected but never had the courage to explore. When I'm gone, you'll have time to study them more deeply than I ever could. You want me to try to communicate with it, after everything you've taught me about its dangers? No, she said firmly. Not yet. Not until you're ready. The binding rituals must continue. They protect both the world from it and it from the world. But someday... She trailed off, her gaze turning inward. Someday there might be a better answer than eternal containment. She died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep. I buried her in a small clearing behind the cabin, marking her grave with stones arranged in one of the protective patterns she'd taught me. I carved her name into the largest stone, Eleanor Thorne, guardian of the boundaries, though I had never known her last name while she lived. In the days that followed, I felt her absence like a physical pain. The cabin, once comfortable in its cluttered coziness, now seemed too large, too empty. The woods, which had become familiar, took on an alien quality again, as if they too mourned her passing. And always at the edges of my awareness, I felt the shadow watching, waiting. I threw myself into studying the journals with renewed purpose. If what Eleanor had told me was true, if there might be a way to heal the broken thing that haunted these woods, I was determined to find it. But the answers, if they existed, were hidden in generations of cryptic notes and half-remembered stories. Spring turned to summer. I settled into my role as caretaker, maintaining the wards as Eleanor had taught me, observing the subtle shifts in the forest's energy. Occasionally, I would drive into Lincoln for supplies, but each time I found myself eager to return to the woods, to the work that had become my purpose. The shadow tested me, of course. It came in dreams at first, offering glimpses of my old life, tempting me with ease and comfort. When I resisted, it changed tactics, sending nightmares of failure, of the boundaries breaking and horrors spilling into the world. And sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark, it would come to the edge of the cabin's wards and simply talk. Tell stories of ancient times, of things it had witnessed long before humans walked these mountains. I never responded, but I listened, recording its words in my own journal, searching for clues to its true nature. 1 year passed, then another. I grew stronger in my knowledge, more confident in my abilities. The binding ritual became easier each spring, though never without cost. I learned to interpret the forest signs on my own, to sense disturbances in the delicate balance Eleanor had maintained. And I began to understand what she had meant about the shadow being a victim as well as a threat. In fragments of stories, in hints gleaned from the oldest journals, I pieced together a different history than the one I'd first been taught. The thing in the woods had once been a guardian itself, a spirit of the forest, neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply part of the natural order. The Abenaki had honored it, left offerings, shared their stories freely. But when European settlers came, bringing with them fears shaped by their own traditions. They saw only a demon to be bound and controlled. Eleanor's ancestors, caught between worlds, had used their knowledge to create bindings that twisted the spirit's nature, cutting it off from the forest it had been part of, trapping it in a state of perpetual hunger that could never be satisfied. What began as protection had become a prison, for the spirit and its jailers alike. I don't know yet if there's a way to undo what was done, to restore balance without unleashing destruction. Perhaps that knowledge died generations ago, or perhaps it never existed at all. But I continue to search, to learn, to maintain the boundaries while seeking a better answer. The shadow still watches, still waits. But sometimes now, when it speaks from the darkness beyond my cabin, I hear something beyond hunger in its ancient voice, something like hope. My name is William Brown, and I am now 37 years old. This happened in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, but it's still happening, and I suspect it always will be, in one form or another, for as long as these ancient forests stand. Some nights, when the wind moves through the trees in certain ways, I imagine I can hear Eleanor's voice, guiding me still. On other nights, I sense a different presence, something vast and patient and very, very old, waiting for the day when we might find a way to heal what was broken. In the meantime, I maintain the wards. I tend the boundaries, I keep the hunger at bay, and I listen to the stories the darkness tells. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the White Mountains of New Hampshire last October, when the leaves had just begun to fall and the air carried that distinct autumn chill that makes you pull your jacket tighter around your shoulders. I had been planning this solo hiking trip for months. After my divorce was finalized in the spring, I needed something to look forward to, something that would challenge me physically while giving me the space to process everything that had happened. My therapist thought it was a good idea. Controlled isolation in nature as a form of exposure therapy for my growing agoraphobia that had developed after spending too many months barely leaving my apartment. The trip would take me through a 10-mile stretch of the less traveled eastern side of the White Mountains, culminating at Lonesome Mountain, a fitting name for my journey of solitary reflection. I had researched the trail thoroughly, downloaded offline maps, and packed enough supplies for 5 days, even though I planned to complete the hike in 3. Better safe than sorry, especially when going solo. The first day went exactly according to plan. The trailhead parking lot near Bretton Woods was nearly empty when I arrived early Thursday morning. Only 2 other cars were parked there, a good sign that I would have the peaceful solitude I was seeking. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool but not cold, with high clouds that diffused the sunlight pleasantly across the forest floor. The trail was well marked at first, and I made good time, covering nearly 7 miles before setting up camp in a small clearing. That night, I built a modest fire, heated some freeze-dried pasta, and settled in with my journal. The sounds of the forest were comforting, the occasional rustle of nocturnal animals, the soft whisper of wind through the trees. For the first time in months, I felt the knot in my chest begin to loosen. Maybe this trip was exactly what I needed. I was awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of twigs snapping nearby. Living in Boston for the past decade had made me forget how dark it gets in the wilderness. I couldn't see anything beyond the dying embers of my fire. I fumbled for my flashlight and swept the beam in a circle around my campsite. Nothing. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded small and vulnerable in the vastness of the forest. No response came, but the snapping sound stopped. Probably just a deer, I told myself as I tried to fall back asleep. But sleep didn't come easily. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from just beyond the reach of my flashlight. The second day dawned misty and gray. I packed up camp quickly, eager to get moving. The trail began to climb more steeply as I approached the foothills of Lonesome Mountain. According to my map, I would pass by an old abandoned logging camp called Hadley's Rest before reaching a natural spring where I planned to refill my water bottles. It was around noon when I noticed something odd. The trail markers had become less frequent, and the path itself seemed less defined. I checked my phone's GPS, but the signal was weak, showing me only a general location that didn't quite match my paper map. Still, I was confident I was headed in the right direction. The topo lines on my map showed I should reach Hadley's Rest within another mile or so. An hour later, I still hadn't found the logging camp. The mist had thickened into a light fog, reducing visibility and giving the forest an otherworldly quality. Trees loomed out of the grayness like sentinels, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The silence was oppressive. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the soft crunch of my boots on the forest floor. I checked my watch. 2:14 p.m. I should have reached the spring by now. I took out my phone again, but the battery had drained from 60% to 15% in less than an hour. That wasn't normal. I switched it to airplane mode to conserve what little power remained and pulled out my compass. The needle spun lazily, not settling in any particular direction. I tapped it, thinking it might be stuck, but it continued to rotate slowly as if confused. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. Compasses don't just stop working. I took a deep breath, fighting down the first flutter of panic. I was an experienced hiker. I had a paper map. Even without technology, I could navigate by the position of the sun, except the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't tell which direction the sun was coming from. Keep moving, I told myself. The trail has to lead somewhere. Another hour passed, and the fog showed no signs of lifting. The trees seemed to grow closer together, the undergrowth thicker. I was certain I was still on a trail, but it didn't look like the well-maintained path I had started on. My legs were beginning to ache, and my water supply was running lower than it should have been at this point in the day. Then I saw it, a structure emerging from the mist. Weathered gray wood, a slumped roof, broken windows like empty eye sockets. Hadley's Rest. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. According to my map, I should have passed this place hours ago. I approached cautiously. The old logging camp consisted of 3 small buildings arranged in a rough semicircle. The largest was probably the main bunkhouse, with a smaller cookhouse beside it, and what might have been a storage shed or office at the far end. All 3 buildings were in advanced stages of decay, with sections of roof missing and walls leaning at precarious angles. "Hello," I called out, not really expecting an answer but feeling the need to announce my presence anyway. My voice seemed to be swallowed by the fog. The silence that followed was broken by a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It rose in pitch, becoming almost human in its anguish before fading away. Wind. It had to be the wind moving through the damaged buildings. What else could it be? Despite my exhaustion, I didn't want to stay at Hadley's Rest. Something about the place felt wrong. But the fog was getting thicker and daylight was fading. Setting up camp in the dark while potentially lost wasn't a good idea. Reluctantly, I decided to spend the night in the most intact corner of the bunkhouse, where at least I'd have some shelter if it rained. I cleared a space on the wooden floor, removing rotted leaves and debris. The interior of the bunkhouse smelled of damp and decay, with an underlying odor I couldn't quite identify. Something almost sweet but unpleasant, like meat gone slightly bad. I tried to ignore it as I unrolled my sleeping bag and set up my small camping stove to heat water for dinner. As darkness fell, the fog pressed against the broken windows like a living thing, seeping through the cracks in the walls. I finished my meal quickly and settled into my sleeping bag, using my headlamp to write in my journal. The entries from the previous day seemed to belong to a different person. Optimistic, peaceful reflections on solitude and healing. Tonight, my hand trembled slightly as I wrote about the fog, the malfunctioning compass, and the strange wailing sound. I was just about to turn off my headlamp when I heard it again. That same keening wail, but closer this time. Much closer. It started low, then rose to a pitch that made me cover my ears. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving only the hammering of my heart in the silence. Something scratched at the wall outside, a light, dragging sound like fingernails on wood. It moved slowly around the perimeter of the bunkhouse, pausing occasionally as if listening. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The scratching stopped at the door, which I had propped shut with a broken chair leg. The door handle rattled. I stared in horror as the chair leg began to slide across the floor, pushed by the pressure on the door. Without thinking, I lunged forward and threw my weight against the door, pushing the chair leg back into place. The pressure on the other side increased. Whatever was out there wanted in. "Who's there?" I shouted, desperation making my voice crack. "What do you want?" The pressure suddenly ceased. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the scratching. I stood with my back against the door, straining to hear any sound of movement outside. Minutes passed. Nothing. Slowly, I backed away from the door, keeping my eyes fixed on it. I grabbed my hiking poles, holding one like a weapon. Sleep was out of the question now. I would wait out the night and leave at first light. The hours crawled by. Occasionally, I heard movement outside, soft footsteps circling the bunkhouse, that strange scratching sound, and once a sound like quiet sobbing that made the hair on my arms stand on end. But nothing tried to enter again. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the fog, I was still awake, still clutching my hiking pole. My eyes burned with fatigue and my muscles ached from holding the same tense position for hours. But I was alive. I had survived the night. I packed quickly, eager to put Hadley's rest behind me. The fog was still thick outside, but not as impenetrable as it had been the previous evening. I studied my map again, trying to orient myself. If I continued east, I should eventually hit the main trail again, or at least reach the road that circled the base of Lonesome Mountain. I set off, moving as quickly as the terrain and limited visibility would allow. After about an hour of hiking, the fog began to thin slightly, and I caught glimpses of a steep ridge rising to my left. That had to be the eastern face of Lonesome Mountain, which meant I was heading in roughly the right direction. My relief was short-lived. As the fog receded, I began to notice things, unnatural things in the forest around me. At first, it was just small items hanging from tree branches. Bits of colored string, small bundles of twigs bound together, fragments of what looked like animal bones. Trail markers left by other hikers, perhaps, but they didn't match any trail marking system I was familiar with. Then I saw the first doll. It was crude, made from what appeared to be dark hair wrapped around a framework of small sticks, with buttons for eyes and a red thread making a grotesque smile. It hung from a low branch, turning slightly in the breeze. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. Who would leave something like this in the middle of the forest? I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the increasing number of strange objects appearing in the trees around me. More dolls, larger bundles of sticks arranged in complex patterns, animal skulls with symbols carved into them. The forest floor was no longer covered just with leaves and undergrowth, but dotted with small circles of stones, inside which various items were carefully arranged: feathers, bones, more bundles of hair. I was in someone's territory, someone who didn't want visitors. The sound came again, that keening wail that had haunted me through the night at Hadley's Rest, but this time it was answered by another wail from a different direction, then another, and another. The forest was suddenly alive with those terrible sounds, surrounding me, closing in. I broke into a run, no longer caring about following a trail or maintaining a direction. I just needed to get away from those sounds. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but fear drove me forward. I don't know how long I ran before I burst out of the trees into a small clearing dominated by a massive, lightning-struck oak. The ancient tree was split down the middle, its two halves splayed open like the pages of a book, creating a sort of natural doorway. The ground around it was bare earth arranged in a perfect circle, with not a single leaf or blade of grass within its border. And standing in front of the split oak was a woman. At least, I thought it was a woman at first glance. She was tall and thin, dressed in what appeared to be layers of tattered clothing that might once have been hiking gear. Her hair was a wild tangle of gray and black, hanging past her waist. But as she turned to face me, I realized with rising horror that something was terribly wrong with her face. Her skin was unnaturally pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Her eyes were too large, too dark, and didn't seem to blink. Her mouth was frozen in a wide smile that showed too many teeth. "Are you lost, traveler?" Her voice was surprisingly melodic, though there was an underlying rasp to it, like dead leaves scraping across pavement. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up with terror. "No need to answer," she continued, taking a step toward me. "I can see that you are. They all are, when they find their way to the Widow Blackwood." The name sent a jolt through me. Widow Blackwood. Where had I heard that before? Then it came to me, a local legend mentioned briefly in one of the hiking guides I'd read. The Widow Blackwood was supposedly a woman who had gone mad with grief after losing her husband and children to disease in the early 1800s. She had fled into the White Mountains and, according to the stories, made a pact with something ancient that dwelled there, becoming neither fully human nor fully spirit. But that was just a story, a local folktale to scare children and entertain tourists. The thing calling itself Widow Blackwood took another step toward me. "You're tired, aren't you? Hungry? Lost and afraid?" Her smile widened impossibly further. "I can help you. I help all the lost ones who find their way to me." "I'm not lost," I finally managed to say, my voice hardly more than a whisper. "I just took a wrong turn. I'm heading back to the main trail now." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "There is no main trail anymore, traveler. Not for you. You crossed the boundary yesterday when you entered the fog. You're in my domain now." I took a step backward. "What do you want from me?" "Want?" She tilted her head at an unnatural angle. "I want to help you. I'm so very lonely here. You see, it's been weeks since my last visitor. And he?" She gestured toward the split oak. "He wasn't very good company in the end." I followed her gesture and noticed for the first time that there was someone, slumped at the base of the tree. A backpack, hiking boots, a human form covered in a layer of what looked like gray moss or fungus. I turned to run, but she was suddenly much closer, her cold hand gripping my arm. Her strength was incredible, her fingers digging into my flesh like steel hooks. "Don't be rude," she hissed, her breath smelling of rotting leaves and something metallic. "I've prepared a place for you. You'll be much more comfortable than poor Mr. Thomas over there. He fought too much, you see, but you won't fight, will you, Michael?" She knew my name. How did she know my name? The fog was closing in again, thicker than before, swirling around us in unnatural patterns. The wailing sounds had returned too, closer now, and with growing horror, I realized they were coming from the forest itself, from the trees, the earth, the very air. "My children are coming," Widow Blackwood said, her grip tightening further. "They're so eager to meet you." Shapes were emerging from the fog, twisted, shambling forms that were vaguely human but wrong in ways my mind couldn't fully process. They moved with jerky, uneven motions, like puppets with half their strings cut, and they were all making that terrible keening sound. Desperate, I twisted violently, breaking free of the widow's grip. I staggered backward, fumbling in my pocket for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around my tactical flashlight. Heavy, metal, with a serrated edge around the lens designed for self-defense. The widow lunged at me, her face contorting into something no longer even remotely human. Her jaw unhinged like a snake's, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Her fingers elongated into claws, tearing through what I had thought were gloves but now realized was just discolored skin. I swung the flashlight with all my strength, connecting with the side of her head. There was a sound like brittle wood breaking, and she stumbled sideways. Dark, thick fluid that wasn't quite blood oozed from the wound. The shambling forms, her children, were closing in. I could see them more clearly now. They had once been human, hikers probably, like me, but their bodies were wrong, transformed. Fungus grew from their eye sockets and mouths. Branches and roots had burst through their skin in places, fusing with their flesh. They were part human, part forest, grotesque hybrids trapped between life and death. I ran. Back into the forest, away from the clearing, away from the split oak and the Widow Blackwood and her monstrous children. I had no direction, no plan beyond escape. The fog swirled around me, sometimes thinning enough to see a few yards ahead, sometimes thickening until I could barely see my own hands. The keening wails followed me, sometimes sounding like they were right behind me, sometimes seeming to come from ahead. The forest itself seemed to be shifting, trees moving when I wasn't looking directly at them, paths disappearing and reappearing in different directions. I don't know how long I ran, hours maybe. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to give out, but terror kept me moving. Whenever I slowed, I would hear the widow's voice carried on the wind. "I'm waiting, Michael. My children are waiting. You can't leave us." As daylight began to fade, far too quickly for normal October hours, I stumbled upon a small stream. Water. I needed water. I fell to my knees beside it, cupping my hands to drink. The water was ice cold and tasted slightly metallic, but I was too thirsty to care. As I straightened up, wiping my mouth, I noticed a small cabin on the other side of the stream. It was well maintained, with smoke curling from a stone chimney. A warm, yellow light glowed in the windows. Relief flooded through me. Civilization. Help. I splashed across the shallow stream and staggered toward the cabin door. I was raising my hand to knock when doubt suddenly gripped me. This didn't make sense. There were no marked cabins on my map in this area, and how convenient that I should find it just as I was at the end of my strength. The door opened before I could knock, and an elderly man stood there smiling warmly. He was short and stout, with a thick white beard and clear blue eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Was wondering when you'd show up," he said cheerfully. Come in. You look half dead, son." I hesitated, one foot on the threshold. "Who are you? How did you know I was coming?" His smile didn't waver. "Name's Henry Prescott. Been the caretaker here for longer than I care to admit. As for how I knew," he shrugged. "She always drives them this way eventually, like a shepherd with her flock." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "She? You mean the widow, yes." Henry's expression grew serious. "She's been more active these past few years, more hungry. Now come inside before her children pick up your scent again." Too exhausted and frightened to argue, I followed him into the cabin. The interior was snug and well kept, with a stone fireplace, comfortable-looking furniture, and walls lined with bookshelves and what appeared to be hunting trophies. But as my eyes adjusted to the light, I realized with growing horror that the trophies weren't animal heads. They were dolls, dozens of them, just like the ones I had seen hanging from the trees. Button eyes, red thread smiles, bodies made of twigs and hair and bits of cloth. Henry followed my gaze and chuckled. "Don't mind those. They can't hurt you as long as you're in here with me." "What are they?" I whispered. "Anchors," he replied cryptically. "Now sit down by the fire before you collapse. I've got stew on the stove and stories to tell you if you want to survive the night." I sank into an armchair by the fire, my muscles screaming in relief. Henry disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen, returning moments later with a bowl of thick stew that smelled better than anything I could remember. As I ate, he explained, Henry had been a forest ranger decades ago, assigned to this remote section of the White Mountains. He had encountered the Widow Blackwood during a search for missing hikers in 1978 and had nearly become one of her children himself. But he had discovered something she feared: fire blessed by faith. His grandmother had been what the locals called a granny woman, a healer and keeper of old knowledge, and had taught him protective rituals involving fire, salt, and iron. Using this knowledge, he had established this cabin as a sanctuary and had been living here ever since, occasionally rescuing lost hikers who stumbled into the widow's domain. The dolls were connected to the people the widow had taken, anchors that helped him locate and monitor her activities. "But why doesn't anyone know about this?" I asked. "Why aren't there warnings? Why isn't this area off limits?" Henry sighed heavily. "It is, in a way. Maps get redrawn. Trails get rerouted. Rangers tell people to avoid certain areas without really explaining why. But the truth is, her domain isn't fixed. It shifts with the seasons, with her hunger. And, most importantly, not everyone who hikes through here encounters her. She chooses who she wants." "Why me?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since I first heard her say my name. Henry studied me with those clear blue eyes. "You're running from something. Pain, maybe. Loss. The widow feeds on that kind of energy. She can sense it, like sharks sense blood in water." He wasn't wrong. The divorce had left me hollow, filled me with a kind of despair I'd never experienced before. Was that what had drawn her to me? "How do I get out?" I asked finally. "Wait here until dawn," Henry said. "The fire will keep you safe tonight. Tomorrow, I'll show you a path that should take you back to the main trail. But you'll have to be quick and follow my instructions exactly. Her domain will try to pull you back in." That night, I slept fitfully on a cot Henry provided. My dreams were invaded by the widow's voice, promising to take away my pain if I would just come back to her, become one of her children, part of the forest forever. I woke several times in cold sweats, but each time, Henry was there, stoking the fire, murmuring what sounded like prayers or incantations. At dawn, he equipped me with a small pouch of salt, an iron nail, and detailed instructions. The path he showed me wasn't on any map, a narrow deer trail that wound between two distinctive rock formations he called the Sisters. "Keep the morning sun on your right shoulder," he instructed. "Don't look back, no matter what you hear. And if the fog starts to roll in, use the salt and the nail exactly as I showed you." I thanked him profusely, but he waved it off. "Just remember what I told you about the widow. And if you make it out, do an old man a favor. Don't come back to this part of the mountains. Find somewhere else for your soul searching." The journey out was a nightmare of its own. The forest seemed determined to mislead me. Paths that should have gone straight suddenly curved back on themselves. The sun would disappear behind clouds at critical moments when I needed it for navigation. And always, just at the edge of hearing, were those keening wails and the widow's voice calling my name. Twice the fog began to roll in, and I used the salt and nail as Henry had instructed, drawing blood from my thumb and mixing it with the salt to create a circle around me. Each time the fog retreated, and the voices with it. It was late afternoon when I finally stumbled onto a marked trail. My relief was so profound I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. An hour later, I reached a ranger station where a startled park employee called for medical assistance. I was dehydrated, exhausted, covered in scratches and bruises, and apparently had been missing for 5 days, not the 2 I thought had passed. The official report chalked my experience up to dehydration, fatigue, and the disorienting nature of the backcountry. I had likely wandered off trail, they said, and my mind had filled in the blanks with hallucinations fueled by local folklore I must have read about before my trip. They found no evidence of a cabin where I described it. No Henry Prescott had ever worked as a ranger in the White Mountain National Forest. And Hadley's Rest, the abandoned logging camp. It had burned to the ground in a forest fire nearly 30 years ago. As for the Widow Blackwood, she was indeed a local legend. But just that, a legend. The story went that she still wandered the forests of New Hampshire, taking lonely, broken-hearted travelers and making them part of her family. Just a story to frighten children and tourists. But I know what I experienced. I still have the iron nail Henry gave me, and sometimes, on cold autumn nights when the wind makes strange sounds around my apartment windows, I swear I can hear her keening wail, calling my name, reminding me that she's still waiting. I never went hiking again. Some parts of the wilderness are meant to stay wild, meant to keep their secrets, and some forms of loneliness are far better than others. So if you find yourself in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, stick to the marked trails. And if you see fog rolling in where no fog should be, turn back. Turn back and don't look behind you, no matter what you hear, because the Widow Blackwood is always looking for new children to join her family, and she knows your name. My name is Patricia Johnson, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Pemigewasset Wilderness area of New Hampshire's White Mountain National Forest last October, when the fall colors were at their peak and the forest was preparing for winter's embrace. I still don't know if what I experienced was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I know one thing for certain: I will never hike alone again. I'd always been the adventurous type. Growing up in Massachusetts, I spent my childhood exploring the woods behind our house, and as I got older, my love for the outdoors only grew stronger. After graduating college with a degree in environmental science, I moved to New Hampshire to work as a conservation specialist for a nonprofit in Concord. My job allowed me plenty of time to explore the White Mountains, and I took full advantage of every opportunity. My friends often joked that I had a death wish, hiking alone in remote areas. "You'll end up on one of those true crime podcasts," my best friend Sarah would say. I always laughed it off. I was careful, I was experienced, and I knew what I was doing. Until I didn't. The trip was supposed to be a 3-day solo adventure into the heart of the Pemigewasset Wilderness, known locally as the Pemi. I had planned it for months, studying maps, reading trail reports, and gathering the necessary gear. The Pemi is one of the most isolated areas in New Hampshire, with some spots nearly 5 miles from the nearest road. That isolation was precisely what I was looking for, a chance to disconnect from the world and find some peace. I set out from the Lincoln Woods trailhead early on a Friday morning in mid-October. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the mid-50s during the day, dropping to the 30s at night. The trail followed an old logging railroad, wide and relatively flat for the first few miles. The forest was ablaze with autumn colors. Brilliant reds, oranges, and yellows, and the earthy scent of decaying leaves filled the air. As I walked deeper into the wilderness, the trail gradually narrowed and became more rugged. By early afternoon, I had covered about 7 miles and crossed several streams. The forest had changed too, becoming denser and darker, with towering pines blocking much of the sunlight. I was making good time, so I decided to push on to a remote campsite near Thoreau Falls that I had marked on my map. It was around 4 p.m. when I first sensed something was off. The forest had gone strangely quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound I made. I told myself it was just the time of day, or perhaps a hawk was nearby, causing the smaller creatures to hide. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I reached the campsite just before dusk. It was a small clearing about 50 yards from the trail, near a bend in the Pemigewasset River. I quickly set up my tent, gathered firewood, and started a small campfire. As darkness fell, the silence gave way to the normal nighttime sounds of the forest, the gentle gurgling of the river, the distant hooting of an owl, the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. I began to relax, enjoying my freeze-dried pasta dinner and a cup of hot chocolate as I watched the flames dance. That first night passed uneventfully. I slept soundly, lulled by the soft murmur of the river and the occasional crackle from the dying embers of my fire. I woke at dawn, refreshed and eager to continue my exploration. My plan for the day was to day-hike deeper into the wilderness, following the Thoreau Falls Trail to its namesake waterfall, and then looping back to my campsite via the Wilderness Trail. The morning was crisp and clear, with a light frost covering the ground. I made a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, packed my day pack with essentials, and set out. The trail was more challenging now, climbing steadily through a landscape of moss-covered boulders and gnarled roots. But the views were worth it. Glimpses of distant peaks through gaps in the trees, and the occasional clearing offering panoramic vistas of the surrounding wilderness. I reached Thoreau Falls around noon. It wasn't particularly high, but the cascade stretched nearly 40 feet across, with the clear mountain water tumbling over smooth granite ledges. I found a flat rock to sit on, ate my lunch, and basked in the solitude. That's when I first heard it, a soft, whispering sound, barely perceptible over the rush of the waterfall. I looked around, thinking another hiker might be nearby, but saw no one. "Hello?" I called out. No response, just the same faint whispering, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood up, suddenly uneasy. The sound faded, and I convinced myself it had just been the wind or water playing tricks on me. I continued my hike, now following the wilderness trail back toward my campsite. The trail lived up to its name, becoming increasingly primitive and hard to follow in places. Twice I had to backtrack after losing the path. The forest seemed different here. Older, untouched, with massive trees that must have been hundreds of years old. The thick canopy blocked most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight beneath. The whispering came again, louder this time. It still didn't sound like words, more like the susurration of leaves, but there was no wind. I stopped, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to get back to the relative safety of my campsite. It was late afternoon when I emerged from the dense forest onto the bank of the Pemigewasset River, about a half-mile upstream from my campsite. I decided to follow the riverbank rather than the trail, as it seemed more direct. That was my first mistake. The river was low that time of year, exposing a narrow strip of rocky beach along its edge. I made good progress at first, but soon the bank narrowed, forcing me to pick my way carefully over slippery rocks and fallen trees. I glanced at my watch, 5:30 p.m. The sun would be setting soon, and I still wasn't back at my campsite. That's when I saw her. On the opposite bank, partially obscured by a stand of birch trees, stood a woman. She was pale, with long dark hair that hung limply around her thin face. She wore what looked like a simple white dress, completely inappropriate for the wilderness and the chilly October weather. But what struck me most were her eyes, dark, hollow, and fixed intently on me. I froze, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and frightened even to my own ears. The woman didn't respond. She didn't move. She just kept staring at me with those empty eyes. "Are you okay?" I tried again. "Do you need help?" Slowly, she raised one arm and pointed downstream in the direction of my campsite. Then she turned and walked into the forest, disappearing behind the birch trees. I stood there for a long moment, heart hammering in my chest. Who was she? How had she gotten here, so deep in the wilderness with no visible camping gear and wearing only a dress? I considered crossing the river to investigate, but the water was swift and cold, and the rational part of my brain warned against it. Instead, I continued downstream, now moving as quickly as I could over the uneven terrain. I reached my campsite just as the last light was fading from the sky. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Tent still standing, my gear undisturbed. I quickly built a fire, larger than I normally would, seeking comfort in its light and warmth. As full darkness descended, I heated water for another freeze-dried meal, but found I had little appetite. The whispers came again that night, after I had retreated to my tent. They seemed to surround me, emanating from the forest on all sides. I zipped my sleeping bag up to my chin, clutching my flashlight like a talisman. Something scratched against the outside of my tent. Once, twice, 3 times. Just a branch blown by the wind, I told myself, even though the air was still. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound brave. No answer, just more whispering, slightly louder now. I thought I could almost make out words, but they were in no language I recognized. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake for hours, listening to the whispers and the occasional scratch against my tent. When I did finally drift off, my dreams were troubled by images of the pale woman standing by my bed, pointing and whispering in that strange language. I woke at first light, groggy and disoriented. The whispers were gone, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest awakening. I unzipped my tent and crawled out, half expecting to see signs of a visitor in the night. The campsite looked undisturbed, but something felt wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was. My backpack was missing. I had left it just outside my tent, containing most of my food, my water filter, and my first aid kit. I searched the entire campsite, thinking I might have moved it and forgotten, but it was nowhere to be found. Had an animal dragged it off? A bear, perhaps? But there were no tracks, no scattered contents, no sign of disturbance at all. It was as if the backpack had simply vanished. Without my water filter, I would have to boil all my drinking water. Without most of my food, I would have to cut my trip short. I still had a day's worth of snacks in my day pack and my camp stove, so I wasn't in immediate danger, but the situation was serious enough that I decided to hike out that day rather than spend another night. I quickly broke camp, stuffing my tent and sleeping bag into my day pack. It was cramped and awkward, but it would do for the hike back to my car. I doused my fire pit with water from the river, scattered the wet ashes, and took one last look around the campsite. That's when I noticed the footprints. They led from the edge of the forest to my tent, small, barefoot prints pressed into the soft earth. They weren't mine. I had been wearing hiking boots, and they hadn't been there the day before. I was certain of it. Someone had visited my campsite during the night. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I needed to get out of there, fast. I shouldered my overstuffed day pack and set off down the trail, moving as quickly as I dared. The forest felt different now, hostile, watchful. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. About 2 miles into my hike, I rounded a bend in the trail and saw her again, the pale woman in the white dress. She was standing in the middle of the path about 50 yards ahead, blocking my way. This time, I could see her more clearly. Her dress was dirty and torn, her feet bare and muddy. Her dark hair hung in tangled skeins around her face, partially obscuring her features, but I could still see those hollow eyes fixed on me. I stopped, fear rooting me to the spot. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, slowly, she raised her arm and pointed off the trail into the dense forest to my right. When I didn't move, she beckoned, then turned and walked into the trees. Every instinct told me to keep to the trail, to ignore her and continue toward safety. But something else, some bizarre compulsion, drew me after her. I stepped off the path and into the forest, following her slight figure as she wove between the trees. She moved with an unnatural grace, seeming to float over the uneven ground, while I stumbled on roots and rocks. "Wait," I called. "Who are you? What do you want?" She didn't respond, didn't even look back, just continued deeper into the forest. I followed for what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. The trees grew thicker, the undergrowth denser. I had to push through tangled bushes and low-hanging branches that tore at my clothes and scratched my face and hands. Finally, she stopped in a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls gray with age, its roof partially collapsed. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, reclaimed by the forest around it. The woman turned to face me. Those hollow eyes boring into mine, then gestured toward the cabin before vanishing. Not walking away, but literally disappearing before my eyes. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, heart pounding in my ears. Every rational thought screamed at me to turn around, to find my way back to the trail in safety. But I had come this far, and some morbid curiosity drove me forward. I approached the cabin slowly, alert for any sound or movement. The door hung askew on rusted hinges. I pushed it open, wincing at the loud creak that shattered the silence. The interior was dark and musty, with shafts of sunlight streaming through holes in the roof and walls. It was a single room, sparsely furnished with the decaying remains of a wooden table, a chair, and a bed frame in one corner. Dust and dead leaves covered everything. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed something on the table: my backpack. Next to it lay a book, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. I approached cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at me. The backpack was definitely mine, with my name written on the tag in my own handwriting. But how had it gotten here? I reached for the book, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in faded handwriting. It appeared to be a journal or diary. I turned to the first page and read, October 15th, 1879. I have found this abandoned trapper's cabin and will make it my home for the duration of my study. The forests of the Pemigewasset region are rich with folklore and supernatural accounts that have yet to be properly documented. The entry was signed, Eleanor Webb, folklorist. I flipped through more pages, skimming entries about local legends and superstitions. Eleanor had come to the White Mountains to collect stories of the supernatural, particularly those involving a spirit or demon the locals called the Whisperer in the Woods. According to the legends she recorded, the Whisperer was said to be the ghost of a young woman who had become lost in the wilderness and died of exposure centuries ago. Her spirit was doomed to wander the forest forever, luring travelers off the paths to share her fate. She would whisper to them, stealing their possessions and leading them to her hidden places deep in the woods. The last entry was dated November 28, 1879. The whispering has grown louder each night. I can almost understand the words now. Something is watching me from the forest. I've seen her twice, a pale figure among the trees. The locals were right. She is real. I must leave this place tomorrow before... The entry ended abruptly, the pen trailing off into a jagged line that crossed the page. Eleanor Webb had never finished her journal, had never left this cabin. I dropped the book as if it had burned me, suddenly understanding the gravity of my situation. The woman I had seen was Eleanor Webb, or rather her ghost, and she had led me to this forgotten cabin just as she had lured countless others over the decades. As if triggered by this realization, the whispering started again, louder than before, surrounding me. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop drastically. My breath fogged in the air. Something cold brushed against my cheek, like skeletal fingers. I grabbed my backpack and ran, bursting out of the cabin into the clearing. The forest had changed. The vibrant autumn colors were gone, replaced by a gray, lifeless landscape. The trees seemed to have moved closer, their branches reaching toward me like grasping hands. And standing at the edge of the clearing was the woman, Eleanor, now joined by others, pale figures in outdated clothing, all with the same hollow eyes, all pointing deeper into the forest. I ran in the opposite direction, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. I had no idea where I was going, no trail to follow, just the desperate need to get away. I don't know how long I ran, or how far. All I know is that eventually I broke through the trees and found myself standing on the bank of the Pemigewasset River. Miraculously, I recognized where I was, less than a mile downstream from the Lincoln Woods trailhead where I had started my hike. I followed the river, moving as fast as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The whispers faded the closer I got to civilization, and by the time I reached my car in the trailhead parking lot, they had stopped completely. I threw my gear in the trunk and drove away, not stopping until I reached the safety of my apartment in Concord. I spent the next few weeks researching Eleanor Webb and the legends of the Pemigewasset wilderness. To my horror, I discovered that several hikers had gone missing in that exact area over the years, their disappearances often attributed to exposure or animal attacks. But I knew better now. They had heard the whispers, seen the woman, followed her into the depths of the forest. I've never told anyone the full story until now. Who would believe me? A ghost luring hikers to their doom in the White Mountains. It sounds like a campfire tale, the kind of story Eleanor Webb might have collected for her research. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that somewhere in the heart of the Pemigewasset wilderness, in a forgotten clearing with a dilapidated cabin, Eleanor Webb is still waiting, still whispering, still searching for company to share her eternal loneliness. I won't be returning to the White Mountains. My hiking gear sits untouched in my closet. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear whispers outside my window. And I wonder, did I ever truly escape the Pemigewasset? Or did something follow me home? Something that's waiting for the right moment to finish what it started in those ancient, unforgiving woods? My name is James Anderson, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote forests of the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire last fall. The decision to go camping alone wasn't my first choice. My therapist had suggested reconnecting with nature after my divorce was finalized, and honestly, I needed to get away from everything. The empty apartment, Sarah's lingering perfume on clothes she'd left behind, the constant flood of messages from well-meaning friends. So, when my buddy Mark's last-minute work emergency left me with 2 weeks of planned vacation time and no companion, I decided to go anyway. Just me and the wilderness. I've always considered myself an experienced outdoorsman. Growing up in Maine, I'd spent countless weekends hiking with my father, learning to read the forest, to track, to survive. But there's a difference between weekend trips and what I was planning. A 10-day solo trek deep into the most remote parts of the White Mountains, following a trail that veered sharply away from the typical tourist paths. The locals in North Conway gave me strange looks when I mentioned my planned route. The waitress at the diner where I stopped for breakfast before heading out actually paused mid-pour with my coffee. "Blackwater Ridge?" she asked, her eyebrows drawing together. "You sure about that, hun? Most folks stick to the marked trails." "I've done my research," I assured her with more confidence than I felt. "The views are supposed to be incredible, and I want some real solitude." She placed the coffee mug in front of me with unusual deliberation. "Well, just be careful up there. Some of those old logging trails aren't maintained anymore, and—" She hesitated, glancing around before leaning closer. "Folks have gone missing up that way." I laughed it off. Every rural area has its local legends, its cautionary tales designed to keep tourists on the designated paths and spending money in town. I thanked her for the coffee, paid my bill, and headed for the trailhead. The first 3 days were exactly what I needed. The late September air was crisp but not cold, the forest a riot of reds and golds that took my breath away. The physical exertion of hiking with a full pack cleared my mind in a way that months of therapy hadn't managed. At night, I'd make camp, cook a simple meal over my portable stove, and fall into the kind of dreamless sleep that had eluded me since Sarah left. It was on the 4th day that things began to change. I woke to fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. My sleeping bag was damp, though there had been no rain. Stranger still was the silence. Forests are never truly quiet. There's always the rustle of small creatures, birdsong, the whisper of wind through leaves. But that morning, there was nothing. Just a pressing, cottony silence that seemed to smother even the sound of my own breathing. Still, I packed up camp and continued on my planned route, using my compass to navigate when the trail became difficult to follow. The fog should have burned off as the morning progressed, but instead it seemed to thicken, clinging to me like ghostly fingers. By midday, I was moving slowly, careful of my footing on the increasingly rough terrain. That's when I first heard it. A voice, distant but distinct, calling what sounded like a name. "Evelyn?" I stopped, listening intently. The voice came again, closer this time. "Evelyn, honey, where are you?" It was a man's voice, elderly, tight with worry. I called back, "Hello? Do you need help?" Silence answered me. I waited, then tried again, louder this time. Nothing. Unease prickled along my spine, but I rationalized it quickly. Sound behaves strangely in fog. It was probably another hiker, further away than they sounded, their voice distorted by the dense air and trees. I continued on, but found myself straining to hear, half expecting that voice to come again. It didn't, but something else did. As the day wore on and the fog stubbornly refused to lift, I began to notice odd things. A branch that seemed to move against the wind, a shadow that didn't quite match the tree casting it. Once, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing between two distant pines, but when I blinked, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, I decided to make camp early. The constant strain of navigating through the fog had exhausted me, and I was starting to question my own senses. I found a small clearing, set up my tent, and got a fire going with difficulty. Everything was damp, and the wood smoldered more than burned, releasing plumes of thick smoke that seemed unnaturally reluctant to disperse in the still air. As darkness fell, the fog took on an eerie luminescence, glowing faintly as if reflecting distant light where there should be none. I sat by my struggling fire, eating a cold dinner of trail mix and beef jerky when I heard twigs snapping in the forest beyond my clearing. "Hello?" I called out, reaching for my flashlight. Its beam cut through the glowing mist, revealing nothing but trees. The snapping came again, circling around to my left. I swung the light, heart pounding. Again, nothing. Then, from the darkness beyond my light's reach, "James?" My blood froze. I hadn't told anyone my name since speaking to the waitress in town. I hadn't encountered another soul on the trail. "Who's there?" I demanded, voice steadier than I felt. A low chuckle answered me, so close it seemed to whisper directly into my ear. I whirled around, stumbling back from the fire, but there was no one there. I retreated to my tent, zipping myself in as if the thin nylon could offer protection from whatever was out there. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake, listening to the strange sounds that seemed to surround my campsite, whispering that might have been wind through leaves, if there had been any wind, footsteps that circled my tent throughout the night, and once, the distinct sound of fingernails trailing along the outside of my tent. By dawn, I was shaking with exhaustion and fear. The fog remained, if anything thicker than before. I packed quickly, forcing down a protein bar and some water, determined to get back to civilization as fast as possible. My plan was to retrace my steps, following my own GPS tracking that I'd been logging on my phone. But when I checked my phone, the screen showed nothing but static. And not the no signal message I'd become accustomed to deep in the woods, actual static, like an old television tuned to a dead channel. When I tried to power it off and on again, the static remained, occasionally flickering to reveal what looked like a face pressed against the screen from the inside, mouth open in a silent scream. I dropped the phone, heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. I was just overtired, my mind playing tricks. I abandoned the phone and resorted to my compass instead, only to find that the needles spun wildly, settling in different directions each time I tried to orient myself. The map I'd brought showed trails that should have been there, but when I tried to follow them, they seemed to vanish into the fog or lead in circles. By midday, I was forced to admit I was lost. The landmarks I'd carefully noted on my way in were either missing or had somehow changed. A distinctive lightning-struck tree now had both halves intact. A small stream I'd crossed now flowed in the opposite direction. My growing panic made it difficult to think clearly, but I forced myself to stop, to breathe, to consider my options. That's when I saw her. She was standing about 30 feet away, partially obscured by the fog and a large pine tree. An old woman, rail-thin, with long white hair that hung in tangled strands around her face. She wore what looked like a nightgown, filthy and torn at the hem, her feet bare despite the cold, damp ground. "Hello?" I called cautiously. "Ma'am, are you lost too?" She didn't respond, just stood there, watching me. Then, slowly, she raised one bony finger and beckoned to me. Every instinct screamed danger, but I was desperate for help, for any human contact. I took a step forward, then another. "Ma'am, do you live around here? I'm trying to find my way back to the main trail." Still, she said nothing, just beckoned again, more insistently. As I drew closer, I noticed something odd about her eyes. They reflected the dim light like an animal's, gleaming yellow in her gaunt face. I stopped. "Who are you?" A smile spread across her face, revealing teeth that were too numerous, too sharp to be human. When she finally spoke, her voice rasped like dry leaves scraping across stone. "The lost ones call me Mother Blackwater," she said. "And you, James Anderson, are very lost indeed." Fear shot through me like an electric current. "How do you know my name?" Her smile widened impossibly. "The forest tells me many things. It told me you were coming. It told me you were alone. It told me about your broken heart." She took a step toward me and I instinctively backed away. "Stay back," I warned, though I had nothing to threaten her with. "Don't you want to find your way home, James? I can show you the path. It's not far." "I'll find it myself," I said, continuing to back away. Her expression changed, hardening. "No one finds their way out of Blackwater Ridge without my help. Not since 1879. With that cryptic statement, she began to move toward me, her movements jerky, almost insect-like. As she came fully into view, I saw with horror that her nightgown was not merely dirty but soaked with what could only be blood, ancient and brown in some places, fresh and red in others. I ran. Blind panic drove me deeper into the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear her behind me, her movements unnaturally fast for someone who appeared so frail, her rasping laughter echoing through the trees. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, finally collapsing against the trunk of a massive oak. As I gasped for breath, the sound of pursuit faded, then ceased altogether. The fog swirled around me, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of the forest, a forest that looked nothing like the one I'd been hiking through for days. The trees here were ancient, gnarled things, their bark black and slick as if coated in oil. Fungus grew in grotesque shapes along their trunks, pulsing slightly as if breathing. The ground was spongy beneath my feet, not with moss but with something that looked disturbingly like flesh, veined and mottled. I'd stumbled into somewhere, wrong, someplace that shouldn't exist. As this realization dawned, I heard a new sound cutting through the silence, the faint, pitiful crying of what sounded like a child. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. If Mother Blackwater was still hunting me, I'd just given away my position. The crying continued, growing more desperate. Despite my fear, I couldn't ignore it. I moved cautiously toward the sound, pushing through underbrush that seemed to clutch at my clothing, leaving smears of something black and viscous on my sleeves. In a small clearing ahead, I found the source of the crying. A little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothes that reminded me of historical photographs from the early 1900s. She was huddled at the base of a tree, knees drawn up to her chest, face buried in her arms. "Hey," I said softly, approaching slowly. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" She looked up, revealing a tear-streaked face that might have been pretty if not for the unnatural pallor of her skin and the dark hollows around her eyes. "She took my mommy," she whispered. "Mother Blackwater took her, and now she wants me too." I knelt beside her, trying to appear calm despite the terror churning in my gut. "What's your name?" "Evelyn," she said. The name hit me like a physical blow. Evelyn, the name the elderly voice had been calling in the fog. "Evelyn, I'm going to help you," I promised, though I had no idea how. "We'll find a way out of here together." She shook her head, fresh tears spilling. "There's no way out. Not anymore. She won't let us leave." "Who is she?" I asked. "This Mother Blackwater?" Evelyn's eyes widened with fear. She was the first to get lost here, a long time ago. The forest changed her. Now she keeps us all, feeds on us. Feeds? The word sent a chill through me. On our fear, our pain, our hope when she lets us think we might escape. Evelyn looked around fearfully. "She'll be coming soon. She always knows when someone's talking about her." As if summoned by the girl's words, a thick tendril of fog slithered into the clearing, coalescing slowly into the form of Mother Blackwater. This time, she wasn't alone. Flanking her were figures that had once been human, their bodies elongated, joints bent at impossible angles, skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Their eyes were empty sockets, mouths sewn shut with what looked like roots that had burrowed into their flesh. "You found my little Evelyn," Mother Blackwater crooned. "How kind of you to bring her back to me." Evelyn whimpered, pressing herself against me. I stood, placing myself between the child and the nightmare before us. "We're leaving," I declared with far more confidence than I felt. "Both of us." Mother Blackwater laughed, the sound like stones grinding together. "Oh, James, no one leaves Blackwater Ridge, not since I claimed it as my own." She gestured to the twisted figures beside her. "These are the last hikers who tried. They make for such loyal companions now." One of the figures twitched, a strangled sound escaping through its sewn lips. With horror, I recognized the embroidered patch on its tattered jacket, the logo of a hiking club from Boston I'd seen mentioned on trail forums. "What do you want?" I asked, voice shaking. "To not be alone," she replied, suddenly sounding almost wistful. "It gets so lonely here, in between visitors. Evelyn has been with me for... Oh, how long has it been, dear?" 93 years, Evelyn whispered. "Yes, that sounds right. 1932 was a good year. Her father searched for her for so long. Called and called." Mother Blackwater's face twisted into a cruel smile. "Just like he called for you this morning." My mind reeled. The elderly voice I'd heard calling for Evelyn. It had been her father, still searching after nearly a century. "You're lying," I said. "None of this is real. Reality is such a fragile thing in places where the veil is thin," Mother Blackwater said cryptically. "This forest remembers the old ways, from before your kind came with your maps and trails and certainties. It remembers when people knew to fear the dark places of the world." She took a step forward, her followers shuffling forward with her. "You'll understand soon enough. After you've been with us a while, you'll see things differently." I backed away, pulling Evelyn with me. My foot struck something hard, a fallen branch, thick and heavy. I grabbed it, holding it before me like a club. Mother Blackwater laughed again. "Oh, that won't help you, James. Nothing so mundane can harm me." "Maybe not," I agreed, "but fire might." Before she could react, I pulled the emergency waterproof matches from my pocket, struck one against the box, and touched it to the end of the branch. The wood was strange here, and it caught immediately, blazing with unnatural intensity, the flames an odd bluish green. Mother Blackwater screamed, a sound no human throat could produce. She and her followers recoiled from the flame. "Run!" I shouted to Evelyn, brandishing the makeshift torch. We fled, plunging through the twisted forest with Mother Blackwater's inhuman shriek echoing behind us. The burning branch illuminated our path, driving back the fog wherever its light touched. Evelyn ran ahead of me, surprisingly swift for her size, leading me through the maze of black trees as if she knew exactly where to go. "This way," she called. "There's a stream ahead. If we can cross it, she can't follow. Running water breaks her power." I didn't question how she knew this. We crashed through the underbrush until the sound of rushing water reached my ears. Through a break in the trees, I could see it. A narrow but deep stream, its waters black in the strange half-light of this place. Behind us, Mother Blackwater's rage shook the forest. Trees groaned and bent toward us, roots erupting from the ground to clutch at our ankles. My makeshift torch was burning low, the flames flickering. At the stream's edge, Evelyn stopped abruptly. "You have to carry me across," she said urgently. "I can't cross on my own." I didn't hesitate, scooping her up with my free arm. She was unnaturally light, like holding a bundle of twigs. I stepped into the stream, gasping at the shocking cold of the water. It rose quickly to my knees, the current stronger than it had appeared. "Hurry," Evelyn urged, glancing fearfully over my shoulder. I struggled forward, the frigid water numbing my legs, the slippery stones threatening my balance with every step. Halfway across, I heard a furious howl and looked back to see Mother Blackwater at the bank. Her face contorted with rage, her followers gathered behind her like a grotesque honor guard. "Give her back," she shrieked. "She belongs to me. They all belong to me." The water was at my waist now, the current threatening to sweep me off my feet. My torch sputtered and died as it touched the water, plunging us into near darkness. Only a faint luminescence from the stream itself provided any light. "Almost there," I gasped, fighting my way forward. As we neared the far bank, Evelyn's grip on my neck tightened painfully. "Thank you, James," she whispered in my ear. "Thank you for setting me free." Her words sent a wave of unease through me, but I was committed now. With a final effort, I hauled us both onto the opposite shore, collapsing onto solid ground. For a moment, there was silence. Then Mother Blackwater began to laugh. "Oh, clever Evelyn," she called across the water. "You finally found someone to carry you across, after all these years." I turned to look at the girl, but she was no longer the child I'd rescued. Her form was changing, aging rapidly before my eyes. Her skin tightened over her bones, hair whitening and lengthening, eyes sinking into dark hollows. Within seconds, I was staring at a perfect mirror image of Mother Blackwater. "What?" I began, scrambling backward. The thing that had been Evelyn smiled with too many teeth. "The stream doesn't break her power, James. It transfers it." Her voice was changing too, taking on the rasping quality of the creature across the water. "I've been trapped on that side for so long, waiting for someone kind enough, foolish enough, to carry me across." On the far bank, the original Mother Blackwater's form was changing as well, becoming smaller, younger, until she had transformed into the little girl I thought I'd been rescuing. "Your turn to wait, Mother," the new Blackwater called gleefully. "Maybe the next one will carry you back." The child that had been Mother Blackwater began to weep, the sound heartbreakingly human. "Please," she begged, "don't leave me here." But my companion was already turning away. "Come, James," she said, extending a bony hand toward me. "Let me show you your new home." Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I lunged to my feet and ran, ignoring her shrieks of rage behind me. I ran blindly through this nightmare forest on the far side of the stream, branches tearing at my face and clothes, roots seeming to reach up to trip me. Behind me, I could hear her in pursuit, moving with that same insect-like swiftness I'd witnessed before. Ahead, the forest grew lighter, the twisted black trees gradually giving way to normal pines. The fog was thinning too, and suddenly I burst out onto a trail. A real, marked hiking trail with a signpost listing distances to various landmarks. I didn't stop running. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but fear drove me onward. I followed the trail downhill, reasoning that it must eventually lead to civilization. As I ran, the forest around me became increasingly normal, the oppressive silence giving way to natural sounds. Birds, wind in the leaves, my own thundering heartbeat. After what seemed like hours but might have been minutes, I heard the most beautiful sound imaginable: human voices. I rounded a bend and nearly collapsed with relief at the sight of a group of hikers coming up the trail toward me. "Hey, are you okay?" one of them called, taking in my wild appearance. Clothes torn, face scratched, eyes wide with terror. I couldn't form coherent words, just pointed back the way I'd come. Two of the hikers, both large men with wilderness first aid patches on their packs, immediately moved to either side of me, supporting my weight as my adrenaline finally gave out. "Let's get him down to the ranger station," one said to the others. "He's hypothermic and probably dehydrated." As they half-carried me down the trail, I kept glancing fearfully behind us, but there was no sign of pursuit. No Mother Blackwater, no twisted followers, no impossible fog. Just normal September woods in the fading afternoon light. At the ranger station, I was treated for exposure, dehydration, and minor injuries. The rangers were concerned but not surprised. Apparently, hikers getting lost in that section of the White Mountains wasn't uncommon, especially when fog rolled in unexpectedly. When I was coherent enough, they asked where I'd been, what trail I'd followed. I described what I could remember of my route before things turned strange, mentioning Blackwater Ridge. The older ranger exchanged glances with his colleague. "There is no Blackwater Ridge on any official map," he said slowly. "Not since 1879. My blood ran cold. What happened in 1879? He seemed reluctant to continue, but finally sighed. The Blackwater logging camp was there. 47 men, women, and children living in a small settlement while the men cleared timber. The winter of '79 was brutal. When spring came and supply teams made it up there, they found the camp abandoned. No bodies, no sign of struggle, just empty. The company shut down operations and eventually the forest reclaimed the area. Some of the old-timers say it's haunted, but he shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. "What about a woman named Evelyn?" I asked. "A little girl who went missing in the 1930s? Another uncomfortable glance between the rangers. "There was an incident in '32, the younger ranger admitted. A family camping near where the old logging camp used to be. Their daughter wandered off. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but she was never found. The father refused to give up, kept going back until the day he died. I spent that night in the North Conway Hospital, ostensibly for observation, but really because no one thought I was in any condition to be alone. I couldn't argue. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mother Blackwater's face, felt Evelyn's grip tightening around my neck as she transformed. The next morning, the same waitress who'd warned me served me breakfast in the hospital. If she recognized me, she didn't say anything, just set down my tray with a sympathetic smile. As she turned to leave, I noticed something strange about her reflection in the window. For just a second, it seemed distorted, elongated, with too many teeth in its smile. But when I blinked, it was gone. I'm telling this story now as a warning. If you hike in the White Mountains and find yourself near what locals might reluctantly tell you was once Blackwater Ridge, turn back. If fog descends and the forest goes silent, run. And if you hear someone calling for Evelyn, do not answer. But most importantly, if you meet a frightened child in those woods, do not, under any circumstances, carry her across running water. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some things should stay lost in the fog forever. I escaped Blackwater Ridge with my life, but I feel her watching me still, waiting for me to let my guard down. Sometimes, in the moment between wakefulness and sleep, I hear her rasping voice whispering my name, promising that one day she'll find me again. And when the fog rolls in, I know she's looking for me.